United States Federal Court, Southern District of New York. Rodney Jones, plaintiff versus Sean Combs, Justin Dior Combs, Ethiopia, Habtemariam, Lucian Charles Grange, Christina Coram, Chalice Recording Studios, Love Records, Motown Records, Universal Music Group, Combs Global Enterprises, John and Jane Doe's 1 through 10, and ABC Corporations 1 through 10. Case number 24-1457, civil action, jury demand. The trigger warning on this, it says, trigger warning, this document contains highly graphic information of a sexual nature, including sexual assault. Additionally, there are graphic images of the aftermath of a shooting, redacted images of sexual intercourse, redacted images of minors, sex workers, and prostitutes, details of sex trafficking, and the illegal distribution of guns and drugs. Plaintiff Rodney Lil Rod Jones, aka Mr. Jones, hereby alleges as and for his complaint against defendant Sean Combs, aka Mr. Combs, defendant Justin Dior Combs, aka J. Combs, defendant Lucian Charles Grange, Mr. Grange, defendant Ethiopia Habtemariam, Ms. Habtemariam, defendant Christina Coram, Ms. Coram, defendant Chalice Recording Studios, CRS, defendant Love Records, LR, defendant Motown Records, MR, defendant Universal Music Group, UMG, defendant Combs Global Enterprises, CGE, John and Jane Doe's 1 through 10, ABC Corporations 1 through 10 as follows. Jurisdiction and venue. 1. This court has personal jurisdiction over the defendants under and consistent with the constitutional requirements of due process, in that the defendants, acting directly or through his agent or apparent agents, committed one or more of the following. A. The transaction of any business within the state. B. The making of any contract within the state. C. The commission of a tortious act within this district. And D. The ownership, use, or possession of any real estate in this state. 2. From September 2022 to the date of this filing, defendants have consistently and purposefully availed themselves of the privilege of conducting activities within New York, thus invoking the benefits and protections of New York law. In return for these benefits and protections, defendants must submit to the burdens of litigation in New York. 3. This litigation arises from or relates to the torturous activities defendants visited upon defendants in the state of New York, California, Florida, and the United States Virgin Islands. This tortuous conduct violated United States federal RICO laws. Requiring defendants to litigate these claims in this district does not offend traditional notions of fair play and substantial justice. Plaintiffs' claims arise from some conduct occurring by defendants in New York. Parties. Plaintiff Rodney Jones is an American artist and music producer. Mr. Jones resides in the state of New York and California. Defendant Sean Combs is a rapper and record executive popularly known by his stage names Puff Daddy, Puffy, P. Diddy, Diddy, Brother Love, or Love. Mr. Combs came to fame in the early 1900s with his record label Bad Boy Records. He rose to prominence in the music and entertainment industry over the decades and is regularly referred to as a hip-hop mogul. Mr. Combs resides at 200 South Mapleton Drive, Beverly Hills, California, 90024. Defendant Sean Combs is pictured there. Defendant Justin Dior Combs is the son of Mr. Combs and Misa Hilton. J. Combs was born on December 30th, 1993. J. Combs is a producer and actor. He has appeared on TV series like Catfish, the TV show, Wild 'N Out, and Hip Hop Squares. Defendant Justin Dior Combs resides at 1550 North El Centro Avenue, Los Angeles, California, 90028. Picture of defendant Justin Dior Combs. Defendant Lucian Charles Grange is the CEO of defendant Universal Music Group. Defendant Lucian Charles Grange resides at 53551 Ross Avenue, Unit 34A, La Quinta, California, 92253, and 668 Chautauqua Boulevard, Pacific Palisades, California, 90272. He's pictured there. Defendant Ethiopia is the former CEO of Defendant Motown Records, the parent company of Defendant Love Records. Defendant Haptamariam resides at 13701 Riverside Drive, Apartment 8, Sherman Oaks, California, 91423-2430. She's pictured there. Defendant Christina Coram is the chief of staff to Sean Diddy Combs, Combs Global Enterprises. She resides at 10445 Wilshire Boulevard, Apartment 501, Los Angeles, California, 90024. Pictured there. Defendant Chalice Recording Studios is a popular record company located at 845 Highland Avenue, Los Angeles, California, 90038, United States. Defendant Motown Records is a record label with a principal place of business located at 1750 Vine Street, Los Angeles, California. Ethiopia Haptamariam was the chairman and CEO of Universal Music Group's Motown Records. Defendant Universal Music Group is a record label with a principal place of business located at 2220 Colorado Avenue in Santa Monica, California. Lucien Grange is the chairman and CEO, Universal Music Group. 14. Defendant Love Records is a record label with a principal place of business located at 6255 Sunset Boulevard, Suite 713, Los Angeles, California, United States, 90028. Defendant Love Records was founded by Mr. Combs and Defendant Motown Records. Defendant Combs Enterprise is a diverse portfolio of businesses and investments that includes music, fashion, fragrance, beverage, marketing, film, television, and media properties. They have a principal place of business located in New York, New York. Combs Global. Rodney Lil Rod Jones, 16. Rodney Lil Rod Jones is from the Windy City, Chi-Town. He was born and raised in Chicago, Illinois. Mr. Jones is the second oldest son and fourth child out of 9 siblings. Mr. Jones comes from a long line of gospel and music influencers. Mr. Jones started playing music at the age of 5. He began playing drums in church, and at the age of 13, he picked up playing the guitar. From 13 to present day, Mr. Jones has taught himself to play over 13 instruments. 18. Mr. Jones is considered a musical prodigy. His talents have led him to produce and create a commercial marketplace for music that has been recorded by some of the most prestigious and highly acclaimed artists in music history. 19. Throughout the duration of his career, Mr. Jones has worked with the South Side of Chicago music scene, playing with the following legendary greats: Georgia Mass Choir, Donald Lawrence, the Clark Sisters, and the Smokey Norfolk. On or about August 2022, Mr. Jones received a call from Mr. Combs requesting that he produce several songs on a rhythm and blues album titled The Love Album, Off the Grid. Love Album. 21. Mr. Jones agreed, and his life has been detrimentally impacted ever since. Summary of events. 22. From September 2022 to November 2023, Mr. Jones produced 9 songs on Mr. Combs' Love album. 23. Mr. Jones lived with Mr. Combs for months at a time, spending holidays, birthdays, and missing major family events. 24. Mr. Jones resided at Mr. Combs' residence located in Los Angeles, California, New York City, and Miami, Florida. Mr. Jones also spent several weeks on a yacht rented by Mr. Combs in the U.S. Virgin Islands. 25. Throughout his time with Mr. Combs, Mr. Jones witnessed, experienced, and endured many things that have went far beyond his role as a producer on the Love album. 26. The claims raised in this complaint have been corroborated through witness statements, video and audio recordings, and images that Mr. Jones has in his possession. 27. Mr. Combs required Mr. Jones to record him constantly. On several occasions, Mr. Combs took Mr. Jones' cell phone and began recording himself. As a result, Mr. Jones has secured hundreds of hours of footage and audio recordings of Mr. Combs, his staff, and his guests engaging in serious illegal activity. 28. Mr. Jones has secured irrefutable evidence of the acquisition, use, and distribution of ecstasy, cocaine, GHB, ketamine, marijuana, and mushrooms, the displaying and distribution of unregistered illegal firearms, Mr. Combs providing laced alcoholic beverages to minors and sex workers at his homes in California, New York, the U.S. Virgin Islands, and Florida. Mr. Combs' Chief of Staff, Christina Coram, KK, instructing her staff to retrieve drugs so she can provide it to Mr. Combs for his consumption. Christian Combs drugging and sexually assaulting a woman. Mr. Combs detailing how he planned to leverage his relationship with Bishop T.D. Jakes to soften the impact of his public image of Cassie Ventura's lawsuit. Young Miami's cousin and or assistant sexually assaulting Mr. Jones. Actor Cuba Gooding Jr. sexually harassing and assaulting Mr. Jones. Rapper redacted on Mr. Combs' yacht consorting with underage girls, sex workers, and R&B singer redacted in Mr. Combs' Los Angeles home consorting with underage girls and sex workers. Chalice Recording Studio shooting. 29. On or about September 12, 2022, Mr. Combs held a writers and producers camp at Chalice Recording Studio at 845 Highland Avenue, Los Angeles, California, 90038. 30. Present at this camp were Mr. Combs, his son Justin Combs, and Justin's friend named G. 31. Mr. G is a 30-year-old tall African-American male. 32. In addition to these individuals, other musicians were present at the camp. This writer has spoken to several musicians who attended the camp. 33. One evening during this camp, Mr. Combs, J. Combs, and G were in a heated conversation. 34. That conversation was moved out of the studio and into a restroom adjacent to where Mr. Jones was sitting. 35. Mr. Jones was approximately 2 feet away from the bathroom when gunshots rang out. Mr. Jones recalls hearing multiple gunshots. This writer spoke with several employees of the yacht rented by Mr. Combs in the U.S. Virgin Islands who personally witnessed defendant Quorum instruct her staff, Brendan Paul, Frankie Santella, and Moy Bond, spike bottles of champagne with ecstasy. Number 2, Christian Combs drugging and sexually assaulting a woman. It says a complaint is forthcoming. Number 3, this is rapper redacted. He is a Philadelphia rapper who dated Nicki Minaj. Number 4, R&B singer redacted. This is a Grammy award-winning R&B singer who had trouble with law enforcement after assaulting a Bijan billionaire. 36. Mr. Jones immediately went into a state of shock and feared that he would be shot next. Mr. Jones genuinely believed that he would be shot through the door due to how close he was. 37. After the shooting ended, a crowd gathered around the restroom. 38. When the door finally opened, Mr. Combs and J. Combs exited. 39. G was lying on the restroom floor in a fetal position, holding his stomach and bleeding out of his leg and hip area. 40. Everyone stood around looking upon G. Frustrated by the lack of aid to G, Mr. Jones dropped everything, ran to G, and immediately began placing pressure on G's gunshot wound to his stomach. 41. He was applying pressure on his stomach. Mr. Jones realized that G was gushing blood from another area near his leg and hip. 42. He decided to lift G and place him to sit on the toilet. Mr. Jones asked the crowd to call the ambulance. 43. Mr. Jones lifted G and brought him to the ambulance at the studio's front. At this time, Mr. Combs and Justin disappeared to another part of the studio. 44. Mr. Combs gave strict instructions to inform the police that he had nothing to do with the shooting. He also forced Mr. Jones to lie to the police by telling them that G was shot standing outside the studio by a drive-by assailant. Mr. Jones has several corroborating witnesses who spoke with this writer anonymously due to fear of retaliation from Mr. Combs. They have agreed to speak publicly when subpoenaed. 46. Mr. Jones has the clothing that he wore that day and believes that it still may have the stains and DNA of G's blood. 47. The following are screenshots of the aftermath of the restroom where G was shot by either Mr. Combs or Jake. 48. Clearly, G was not shot outside of the studio as Mr. Combs instructed his team to report to law enforcement. 49. Mr. Combs and defendant LR, MR, UMG, and CRS provided private security for the writers' camp at defendant CRS. 50. The security was porous and lackluster at best. 51. The fact that either Mr. Combs and J. Combs were allowed to enter CRS with guns and those guns were not confiscated by security is a clear breach of duty by Mr. Combs, defendants LR, MR, and UMG to protect Mr. Jones and the other attendees of this writers' camp. 52. As a result of this shooting, Mr. Jones is severely traumatized. Mr. Jones now suffers from PTSD, severe anxiety, depression, and insomnia. Mr. Jones was sexually harassed and assaulted by Mr. Combs. 53. Throughout his time living with Mr. Combs, Mr. Jones was the victim of constant, unsolicited, and unauthorized groping and touching of his anus by Mr. Combs. 54. These events took place in L.A., New York, Florida, and the United States Virgin Islands. 55. In addition to the unsolicited and unauthorized touching, Mr. Jones was forced by Mr. Combs to work Mr. Combs' bathroom as Mr. Combs walked around naked and showered in a clear glass enclosure. 56. As a heterosexual Christian man, Mr. Jones was uncomfortable with Mr. Combs' advances and expressed his discomfort to Mr. Combs' chief of staff. 57. KK responded to Mr. Jones' complaint with, "You know, Sean will be Sean." 58. KK also attempted to downplay Mr. Combs' groping of Mr. Jones' anus and genitals as friendly horseplay, stating that those acts were Mr. Combs' way of showing that he likes you, Mr. Jones. 59. Despite these assurances, on several occasions when Mr. Combs began to undress and walk around his house naked, KK would say, "Okay, I am leaving now," and she would disappear. 60. KK's hypocrisy is breathtaking at best or enabling at worst. 61. Mr. Jones believes that KK aided and abetted Mr. Combs' sexual assaults of him and was working with Mr. Combs to groom him into accepting a homosexual relationship. 62. Through these sexually deviant acts, one would say Mr. Combs has a pattern and practice of engaging in such nefarious activities. This ongoing conduct shows that Mr. Combs cannot be rehabilitated. Mr. Combs attempted to groom Mr. Jones into engaging in gay sex. 63. Mr. Combs was aware that Mr. Jones looked up to and idolized music producer Stevie J. 64. Stevie J is an American DJ, producer, and television personality. 65. Stevie J was part of the Bad Boy Records production team, The Hitmen. 66. In 1997, Stevie J won a Grammy Award for his work on Puff Daddy's debut album. Throughout the late 1990s, Stevie J produced for several artists including Mariah Carey, Tevin Campbell, the Notorious B.I.G., 112, Jodeci, Faith Evans, Jay-Z, and Eve. 68. Stevie J was one of the producers on the Love album. 69. Mr. Combs used access to Stevie J and his knowledge of Mr. Jones' admiration of Stevie J to groom and entice Mr. Jones to engage in homosexuality. 70. Mr. Combs went so far as to share a video of Stevie J anally penetrating a Caucasian male without a condom. This was done to ease Mr. Jones' anxiety concerning homosexuality. According to Mr. Combs, this is a normal practice in the music industry. Look, even Stevie J is doing it. 71. Mr. Combs informed Mr. Jones that he had engaged in sexual intercourse with rapper Redacted, R&B singer Redacted, and Stevie J. 72. Mr. Combs promised to make sure that Mr. Jones wins Producer of the Year at the Grammys if he engaged in homosexuality. 73. The following are screenshots of the video of Stevie J anally penetrating a Caucasian male that Mr. Combs provided to Mr. Jones. Now the footnotes on page 13. 5. He is a Philadelphia rapper who dated Nicki Minaj. This is from Mr. Combs informed Mr. Jones that he had engaged in sexual intercourse with rapper Redacted. 6 is he performed at the Super Bowl and had a successful Vegas residency. That is R&B singer Redacted. And 7, the following are screenshots of the video. This writer is in possession of the video and will provide a copy to the court. There's another screenshot of the video. Thanksgiving 2022. Mr. Jones is sexually assaulted by Young Miami's cousin. 74. On Thanksgiving Day 2022, Mr. Jones was in Mr. Combs' house located in Miami, Florida. Young Miami and her female cousins were also present. 75. Mr. Combs was intoxicated and offered cocaine to Mr. Jones. Mr. Jones rejected him and proceeded to walk to the restroom. 76. While using the restroom, Young Miami's cousin burst into the bathroom and began groping Mr. Jones. Mr. Jones believes that Mr. Combs sent her in there to sexually assault Mr. Jones. 77. As she entered the bathroom, she dropped to her knees and began performing oral sex on Mr. Jones' exposed penis. Mr. Jones pushed her away and exited the bathroom. 78. Young Miami's cousin did not accept Mr. Jones' rejection as she proceeded to follow Mr. Jones out of the bathroom. 79. She started undressing and attempted to straddle him and have sex with him in the presence of Mr. Combs and his staff. 80. Once again, Mr. Jones pushed her off. The following are images from a video of Young Miami, her cousin, Mr. Jones, and Mr. Combs. There's screenshots of the video. It's captioned, Mr. Jones and Mr. Combs on Thanksgiving Day, right before Mr. Combs invites Mr. Jones into the restroom and attempting to force him to take cocaine. And then Young Miami and her female cousin who sexually assaulted Mr. Jones on Thanksgiving Day 2022. Trafficking in Victims Protection Act. 81. Throughout his time with Mr. Combs, Mr. Jones was transported from California to New York, Florida, in the United States Virgin Islands. 82. During this time, Mr. Jones was forced to solicit sex workers and perform sex acts to the pleasure of Mr. Combs. 83. On or about February 4th, 2023, Mr. Combs forced Mr. Jones to bring prostitutes and sex workers back to his home in Miami, Florida. Then the footnote says 8. This writer is in possession of the video and will provide a copy to the court. That's referring to the video. That's referring to the video of Mr. Combs, Mr. Jones, Young Miami, and her female cousin. The sex workers that Mr. Combs forced Mr. Jones to bring back to his home. 84. On or about February 2nd, 2023 incident, Mr. Jones believes Mr. Combs drugged him. Mr. Jones recalls waking up naked, dizzy, and confused. He was in bed with 2 sex workers and Mr. Combs. He also recalls aimlessly wandering around the house with no clothes on. Sex workers in Mr. Jones' bed in the morning after being drugged. Picture. 85. On another occasion in Miami, Florida, on Thanksgiving night of 2022, Mr. Combs asked Mr. Jones and DeForest Taylor to enter the studio bathroom. 86. He asked them for a $100 bill because he wanted to do cocaine with him. 87. Mr. Jones was scared, but luckily he didn't have a $100 bill, so Mr. Combs waited a little later to do coke with Young Miami. 88. Later that evening, he required Mr. Jones to solicit sex workers from Booby Trap on the river located at 3615 Northwest South River Drive, Miami, Florida, 33142. Mr. Jones did so, and Mr. Combs forced him to engage in unsolicited sex acts with these workers. A picture of Booby Trap on the river. 89. As part of Mr. Jones' sex worker recruitment tools, Mr. Combs provided Mr. Jones with an exclusive bad boy baseball cap and required him to wear it to Booby Trap on the river as a signal to any sex worker he approached that Mr. Combs was in town and had sent Mr. Jones to recruit them. 90. Mr. Jones had no desire to visit Booby Trap on the river. Mr. Jones had no desire to solicit sex workers from Booby Trap on the river. Mr. Combs used his power and influence to intimidate and force Mr. Jones into soliciting sex workers from Booby Trap on the river. As detailed below, Mr. Combs used many tactics to maintain dominion and control of Mr. Jones. 91. Apparently, these workers were accustomed to servicing Mr. Combs and would know that he is in town by the sight of the bad boy's baseball cap. 92. The following are Instagram profiles of 2 of the sex workers that Mr. Combs required Mr. Jones to solicit and have sex with at his home in Miami, Florida. Here's a picture of 2 of them. 93. Mr. Jones had no desire to solicit and or have sex with the individuals in the previous paragraph. Mr. Combs used his power and influence to intimidate and force Mr. Jones into soliciting and sleeping with these women. 94. The following is the phone number of another sex worker that Mr. Combs required Mr. Jones to solicit and perform sex act with at his home in Miami, Florida. There's a picture of a contact card for Booby Trap, Miami. 95. Mr. Jones had no desire to solicit and or have sex with the individual in the previous paragraphs. Mr. Combs used his power and influence to intimidate and force Mr. Jones into soliciting and sleeping with the individuals above. 96. Mr. Combs used many tactics to maintain dominion and control over Mr. Jones. He promised him a Grammy for Producer of the Year for the Love album. He offered him $250,000 to purchase all the instruments he wanted. He promised him ownership of his $20 million property, One Star Island in Miami, Florida. He promised access to record label executives like defendants Lucien Charles Grange and Ethiopia Habta Mariam. 97. Mr. Combs would often switch up his approach. He would go from promising Mr. Jones the world to threatening Mr. Jones with physical harm. Mr. Combs threatened to eat Mr. Jones' face and informed Mr. Jones that he is willing to kill his mother, Janice Combs, if he must in order to get what he wants, so he wouldn't think twice to harm Mr. Jones. Page 20. Mr. Combs and J. Combs solicits drugs and engages in illicit sex acts with minors and sex workers. 98. On or about July 2nd, 2023, in California, Mr. Combs had a listening party at his home. 99. Present at this party was an R&B artist, redacted, J. Combs, sex workers, and some underage girls. 100. The event began at 7 p.m. Mr. Combs requested female sex workers and required Mr. Jones to solicit them. An hour later, several sex workers appeared. 101. In addition to sex workers, there were at least 5 women in the crowd that were under the age of 16. 102. Mr. Combs forced all the women to drink laced De Leon liquor. Upon information and belief, Mr. Combs laced the liquor with ecstasy. 103. Mr. Combs did not check the identification of any of these underage girls. 104. The presence of these underage women made Mr. Jones very uncomfortable. 105. He attempted to leave, and Mr. Combs forced him to stay. 106. Mr. Combs went so far as to take Mr. Jones's car keys to prevent him from leaving. 107. After being forced to drink laced De Leon shots, Mr. Jones began feeling lightheaded and recalls passing out and waking up at 4 a.m. the following morning, naked with a sex worker sleeping next to him. 108. Screenshots of a video from that night is embedded below. Footnote 9. This is an R&B artist redacted. He is a Grammy Award-winning R&B singer who had trouble with law enforcement after assaulting a Bijan billionaire. Number 10. This is number 10. Screenshots of a video. This writer is in possession of the video and will provide a copy to the court. Then there are screenshots of Mr. Combs with an underage girl, an underage female, a sex worker, and Justin Combs with an underage girl. Mr. Combs attempts to pass off Mr. Jones to Cuba Gooding Jr. 109. Mr. Jones believes that Mr. Combs was grooming him to pass him off to his friends. 110. This fear became reality when Mr. Combs introduced Mr. Jones to Cuba Gooding Jr. while they were on Mr. Combs' yacht. 111. During the introduction, Mr. Combs suggested that Cuba get to know Mr. Jones better. He then left them alone in a makeshift studio on the yacht. And there's a picture of Mr. Combs and Cuba Gooding Jr. moments before Mr. Jones is assaulted. 112. As evidenced by a video, of which screenshots are embedded below, Cuba Gooding Jr. began touching, groping, and fondling Mr. Jones' legs, his upper inner thighs near his groin, the small of his back near his buttocks, and shoulders. 113. Mr. Jones was extremely uncomfortable and proceeded to lean away from Mr. Gooding Jr. 114. He rejected his advances, and Mr. Gooding Jr. did not stop until Mr. Jones forcibly pushed him away. The following is a screenshot of the encounter with Cuba Gooding Jr. And footnote for that, the following is a screenshot. It's number 11. This writer is in possession of the video and will provide a copy to the court. And there's a screenshot of Cuba Gooding Jr. forcibly touching Mr. Jones on Mr. Combs' yacht. The Love album. 115. Throughout his time with Mr. Combs, Mr. Jones was under an implied work-for-hire agreement. 116. He was not compensated for his time living with Mr. Combs or for the songs he produced. 117. As evidence, he was listed as a producer for the following songs on the Love album's final release: Deliver Me, Stay Part 1, Reaching, What's Love, Stay a While, Moments, Need Somebody, Homecoming, and Tough Love. 118. Mr. Combs and defendants LR, MR, UMG all benefited from Mr. Jones's work product. 119. They failed to compensate Mr. Jones for his work. 120. As a result, Mr. Combs and defendants LR, MR, UMG were all unjustly enriched at the expense of Mr. Jones. 121. Mr. Jones attempted to work with Mr. Combs to secure his publishing and royalty rights for the work he completed on the Love album. Mr. Combs only offered Mr. Jones $29,000 for 13 months, thousands of hours of work, and 9 songs that made it to the Love album. Ironically, Mr. Jones was willing to take $50,000, his publishing and royalties. Mr. Combs' self-serving greed would not allow him to pay Mr. Jones an additional $21,000. Footnotes. Number 12. Footnotes. Number 12. It's Cuba Gooding Jr. It says Mr. Gooding Jr. has a storied history of sexually assaulting and forcibly touching individuals against their will. And then there's a link from a USA Today article. 13. This is Mr. Combs with self-serving greed would not allow him to pay. This writer has retained other creatives, artists, and writers who have also experienced the same treatment from Mr. Combs and will file suit in the coming weeks. 122. Mr. Combs' deceptive business practice became so bad that Mr. Jones was left with no choice other than to make a public plea on social media for Mr. Combs to pay him for his work. 123. After publicly requesting that Mr. Combs do the right thing and pay him fairly, Mr. Jones received an onslaught of threatening messages from Stevie J and Love Records A&R DeForest Taylor. Then there's screenshots of DeForest Taylor threatening Mr. Jones. The message just says, "You playing, I'm in studio." There's a voice recording. "LOL, you 100% liar and weirdo. Good luck. Number still same. Run into nigga, come talk to me in public on a public podcast and forum," as was all from DeForest Line 2. Mr. Combs used his power and influence to threaten and intimidate Mr. Jones. 124. According to Mr. Jones, Mr. Combs is very forceful and demanding. 125. Mr. Combs does not take no for an answer and would often threat to inflict bodily harm on Mr. Jones if Mr. Jones did not comply with his demands. 126. As detailed above, Mr. Combs threatened to eat Mr. Jones's face. Then there is a footnote for 14. That is for Stevie J and Love Records A&R DeForest Taylor. As the A&R of Love Records, DeForest Taylor did not require Mr. Jones or any of the other creatives, musicians, or artists to sign an NDA. 127. On another occasion, while standing in Mr. Combs' bedroom, Mr. Jones was forced to watch as Mr. Combs displayed his guns and bragged about getting away with shooting people. 128. Mr. Combs shared that he was responsible for the shooting in the nightclub in New York City with rapper Shine. Then there is a screenshot of a Complex article. It says Diddy's former bodyguard accuses the rapper of snitching on Shine over 1999 shooting. As the story goes, bad boy artist Shine was jailed for attempted murder, assault, and reckless endangerment charges after a shooting incident at a New York club. 129. He shared that artist and Mr. Combs' girlfriend at the time, Jennifer Lopez, a.k.a. J-Lo, carried the gun into the club for him and passed him the gun after he got into an altercation with another individual. There's a picture of J-Lo and Diddy. Sean Combs, Jennifer Lopez arrested after New York shooting. This is from a Chicago Tribune article. It's a screenshot. 130. The shooting in Chalice Recording Studios confirmed Mr. Combs' statements. 131. These statements reinforced Mr. Jones' fear of Mr. Combs and strengthened Mr. Combs' dominion and control of Mr. Jones. 132. Mr. Jones was terrified of Mr. Combs. He felt like he could not tell him no. 133. Mr. Combs consistently made it clear that he has immense power in the music industry and with law enforcement. 134. Mr. Combs made it clear that his head of security, Fahim Muhammad, Mr. Muhammad, had the power to make people and problems disappear. And there's a picture of Fahim Muhammad. 135. Mr. Combs instructs his staff to always contact Mr. Muhammad if they are ever pulled over by the police in Miami or California. 136. Upon information and belief, Mr. Muhammad spoke with the LAPD after G was shot at CRS. The LAPD was in CRS and witnessed the blood in the restroom, and they went with the bogus claim that the shooting of G occurred outside of the studio. This was all thanks to Mr. Muhammad's connections with law enforcement. 137. Mr. Jones had no reason to disbelieve Mr. Combs, as he had seen firsthand through the shooting of G and the subsequent silence of the LAPD and the media that Mr. Combs indeed had the power to harm him. 138. The LAPD spent hours in CRS after the shooting of G, yet there were no arrests. Mr. Jones witnessed the LAPD in the restroom pictured above, yet no arrests were made. 139. The morning after the shooting, Mr. Jones and several others arrived at CRS and G's blood was still on the floor of the restroom, and Mr. Combs hired a cleaning crew to clean it up. Defendants Ethiopia Habtemariam, Lucien Charles Grange, Motown Records, Love Records, and Universal Music Group aided, abetted, and profited off of Sean Combs' RICO enterprise. 140. Mr. Jones recalls seeing defendant Grange visiting Mr. Combs' home in Miami, Florida, and Los Angeles, California. There's a footnote for defendant Grange. It says 15. TikTok is one of the most important short video platforms in the world. It has a significant impact on the spread of global music. Today, it is believed that artists are paying more and more attention to producing music suitable for dissemination on TikTok. Due to failed contractual renewal negotiations between Universal and TikTok, a lot of music had to be removed from TikTok. This comes from the alleged lack of protection TikTok takes to ensure UMG artists' rights and creativity is preserved, as well as fair compensation. On the contrary, it has been alleged that the renewal failed due to UMG's own financial agenda in putting their interests first before the artists. This move has cost artists affected their opportunities to further their growth and development within their art, as well as huge financial loss. However, UMG will still continue to profit off these artists, whether their music will be released back to TikTok or not. 141. According to Mr. Jones, who, whenever defendant Grange visited Mr. Combs at his homes, it would be in the evening, and he and Mr. Combs would disappear for hours in Mr. Combs' bedroom. 142. Defendant Grange sponsored and attended several Love album listening parties at Mr. Combs' home in Los Angeles, California. These parties were sponsored by defendants MR, LR, and UMG. As evidence above, these parties had sex workers and underage girls present. 143. During these parties, defendant Grange knew or should have known that Mr. Combs was drugging the attendees through lace bottles of De Leon tequila and Ciroc vodka. 144. It is no secret that Mr. Combs had specific bottles of alcohol designated for females and other bottles designated for his staff, his artists, and himself. This fact was detailed by former artists and bodyguards of Mr. Combs. 145. As a sponsor of these events, defendant Grange had a duty and obligation to ensure that sex workers and underage girls were not present, and that Mr. Combs was not spiking the alcohol with date rape drugs. 146. On YouTube channel The Art of Dialogue, former bodyguard Gene Deal exposed Mr. Combs' pill mixing method used to spike cranberry juice and orange juice. According to Mr. Deal, Mr. Combs would place ecstasy and other date rape drugs in the juices. 147. On YouTube, The Art of Dialogue, former artist Mark Curry exposed Mr. Combs spiking bottles of Moet champagne in the VIP section of nightclubs. Mr. Combs would have a set of Moet champagne bottles for his artists and a set for women. Then in the footnotes, there are links to both of those aforementioned videos. 148. This writer has spoken with several employees of Mr. Combs who witnessed defendant Coram instruct her staff to lace champagne, De Leon, and Ciroc liquor bottles with ecstasy and other illicit drugs. 149. Mr. Jones recalls seeing defendant Havta Merriam visiting Mr. Combs' home in Miami, Florida, and Los Angeles, California. 150. According to Mr. Jones, whenever defendant Havta Merriam visited Mr. Combs at his homes, it would be in the evening, and she and Mr. Combs would disappear for hours in Mr. Combs' bedroom. 151. According to Mr. Jones, defendant Havta Merriam visited Mr. Combs at defendant CRS during Mr. Combs' writing camp. 152. Defendant Havta Merriam sponsored and attended several Love album listening parties at Mr. Combs' home in Los Angeles, California. These parties were sponsored by defendants MR, LR, and UMG. As evidence above, these parties had sex workers and underage girls present. 153. During these parties, defendant Havta Merriam knew or should have known that Mr. Combs was drugging the attendees through lace bottles of De Leon tequila and Ciroc vodka. 154. As a sponsor of these events, defendant Havta Merriam had a duty and obligation to ensure that sex workers and underage girls were not present and that Mr. Combs was not spiking the alcohol with date rape drugs. Defendant Christina Coram is the Ghislaine Maxwell to Sean Combs' Jeffrey Epstein. 155. According to Mr. Jones, during the 13 months he lived and traveled with Mr. Combs, he witnessed Mr. Combs display and distribute guns from his bedroom closet in Miami, Florida, and Los Angeles, California, to questionable individuals dressed in all black. 156. According to Mr. Jones, during the 13 months he lived and traveled with Mr. Combs, he witnessed Defendant Quorum openly order her assistants to keep Mr. Combs high off gummies and pills. Defendant Quorum required all employees from the butler, the chef, to the housekeepers to walk around with a pouch or fanny pack filled with cocaine, GHB, ecstasy, marijuana, and gummies, 100 to 250 milligrams each, and Tucci, a pink drug that is a combination of ecstasy and cocaine. Tucci is pictured. 158. It was important to Defendant Quorum to have Mr. Combs' drug of choice immediately ready when he asked for it. 159. Defendant Quorum ordered sex workers and prostitutes for Mr. Combs. 160. Defendant Quorum ordered and distributed ecstasy, cocaine, GHB, ketamine, marijuana, and mushrooms to Mr. Combs and his celebrity guests who were present on his rented yacht and in his homes in L.A., New York City, and Miami. 161. On multiple occasions, Defendant Quorum forced Mr. Jones to carry Mr. Combs' drug pouch against his will. 162. As the chief of staff, Defendant Quorum was instrumental in organizing and executing the RICO enterprise. Defendant Quorum had the following individuals execute the following tasks for the RICO enterprise. A. Stevie J. He recruits sex workers and attends and participates in freak-offs. B. Justin Combs solicits prostitutes, underage girls, and sex workers, would engage in freak-offs. C. Brennan Paul works as Mr. Combs' mule. He acquires and distributes Mr. Combs' drugs and guns. Footnotes for 18, and keep Mr. Combs high off the gummies and pills. We have a recording of this and we'll provide it to the court. 19, freak-offs. We have a video of Mr. Combs, Stevie J, and Plaintiff Jones at a strip club. Mr. Combs is recording the video while coaching and training Plaintiff Jones how to recruit the sex workers. Brendan Paul and Mr. Combs are pictured. D. Frankie Santella works alongside Brendan. While Brendan acquires and distributes Mr. Combs' drugs and guns, Frankie carries the money and pays for the guns and drugs. A picture of Frankie Santella and Sean Combs. E. Moy Bond hires sex workers, attends and participates in freak-offs. There's a footnote for Frankie Santella. 20. He's the vice president of music management and strategic partnerships, vice president for Combs Global. It has it written out twice. Then Moy Bond is pictured from Thanksgiving 2022 when Mr. Combs offered Mr. Jones cocaine. 163. Mr. Combs funded and used his affiliation with local gangs and gangs leaders who would frequent his homes in L.A. and Miami to secure the drugs and guns he attained and distributed out of his homes in L.A. and Miami. 164. Defendants executed their RICO enterprise with threats of violence, threatening to eat plaintiff's face, displaying and distributing guns in plaintiff's presence, bragging about having law enforcement under control, bragging about murdering people, and bragging about bribing witnesses and jurors in the criminal case concerning the 1999 New York City nightclub shooting with Shine. 165. Defendants executed their RICO enterprise with threats of isolation from the music and entertainment industry, parading powerful music industry executives such as defendants Lucy and Charles Grange, Ethiopia Habtemariam, at his parties filled with sex workers, minors, and illegal drugs such as ecstasy, cocaine, GHB, ketamine, marijuana, and mushrooms. 166. Defendants executed their RICO enterprise with threats of non-payment for work completed, fake promises of cash payments, $250,000, producer of the year Grammy Awards, and guaranteed access to future projects in a $20 million home on Star Island in Miami. There is a footnote for gang leaders, 21. Plaintiff has intentionally left the names and images of these individuals out of the pleading out of fear of retaliation. Mr. Combs is allowed to wreak havoc. 167. While living and traveling with Mr. Combs, Mr. Jones discovered that Mr. Combs has hidden cameras in every room of his house. 168. Mr. Jones believed that Mr. Combs has recordings of defendants Lucy and Charles Grange, Ethiopia Habtemariam, as well as other celebrities, music label executives, politicians, and athletes. 169. Upon information and belief, These individuals were recorded without their knowledge and consent, and as is the case with the homosexual tape of Stevie J that Mr. Combs provided to Mr. Jones. Mr. Combs possesses compromising footage of every person that has attended his freak-off parties and his house parties. 170. Upon information and belief, due to his treasure trove of evidence he has in his possession, Mr. Combs believes that he is above the law and is untouchable. 171. Upon information and belief, Mr. Combs employs Jose Cruz as his IT director. This writer has spoken to several former employees of Mr. Combs who confirmed that Jose Cruz is the gatekeeper to all of Mr. Combs' recordings. 172. Upon information and belief, Jose Cruz intentionally hides behind the cameras and from social media and the internet due to all of the incriminating acts he was required to record of Mr. Combs, for Mr. Combs. Then there's a contact card pictured. It says Jose Puffs Tech Guy, Cali. First cause of action. Conduct and participate in a RICO enterprise through a pattern of racketeering activity, violation of Racketeer Influenced and Corrupt Organization Act codified at 18 U.S.C. 1962A, C through D, against defendants Lucien Charles Grange, Ethiopia Habtemariam, Sean Combs, Justin Combs, Christina Coram, Combs Global, Motown Records, Love Records, and Universal Music Group. 173. Mr. Jones incorporates by reference all preceding paragraphs and realleges them as if set forth fully herein. 174. As respondent superior, defendants Lucien Charles Grange, Ethiopia Habtemariam, Combs Global, Motown Records, Love Records, and Universal Music Group, the respondent superior collective, are 100% liable for the actions of Sean Combs, Justin Combs, Christina Coram, as they were acting in their capacities as the respondent superior collective employees when they committed the acts detailed below. The respondent superior collective failed to adequately monitor, warn, or supervise the actions of Sean Combs, Justin Combs, and Christina Coram. 175. Defendants are individuals and or entities within the meaning of person as defined in 18 U.S.C. 1961-3. Because each is capable of holding, it does hold, a legal or beneficial interest in property. The association is composed of Lucien Charles Grange, Ethiopia Habtemariam, Sean Combs, Justin Combs, Christina Coram, Combs Global, Motown Records, Love Records, Universal Music Group, John and Jane Doe's 1 through 10, and ABC Corporations 1 through 10. 176. Section 1962A makes it unlawful for any person who has received any income derived directly or indirectly from a pattern of racketeering activity or through a collection of an unlawful debt in which such person has participated as a principal with the meaning of Section 2, Title 18, United States Code, to use or invest directly or indirectly any parts of such income or the proceeds of such income in the acquisition of any interest in or the establishment or operation of any enterprise which is engaged in or the activities of which affects interstate or foreign commerce, 18 U.S.C. 1962A. 177. Section 1962C makes it unlawful for any person employed by or associated with the enterprise engaged in or the activities of which affect interstate or foreign commerce to conduct or participate directly or indirectly in the conduct of such enterprises' affairs through a pattern of racketeering activity, 18 U.S.C. 1962C. 178. 1962D makes it unlawful for any person to conspire to violate Section 1962A and C, among other provisions, 18 U.S.C. 1962D. 179. Defendants are associated with each other as an enterprise within the meaning of enterprise as defined in 18 U.S.C. 1961-4. 180. Defendants have unlawfully increased their profits by luring and deceiving producers, musicians, writers, creators, and artists such as plaintiff to transport drugs, ecstasy, cocaine, GHB, ketamine, marijuana, and mushrooms, transport firearms, solicit minors, exotic dancers, sex workers, and to utilize their talents and labor to produce music and other tangible goods and service without compensation. 181. The RICO enterprise, which all defendants have engaged in, and the activities of which affected interstate and foreign commerce, is comprised of an association, in fact, of persons, including each defendant and other unnamed co-conspirators. That association, in fact, was structured by various contracts and non-contractual relationships between the defendants, by which defendants assumed different roles in agreeing to carry out a mail and wire fraud scheme to acquire drugs, firearms, and prostitutes, minors, sex workers, and the labor of producers, musicians, writers, creators, and artists, such as plaintiff, to utilize their talents and labor to produce music and other tangible goods and services without compensation. 182. The members of the RICO enterprise all share a common purpose: to enrich themselves financially and sexually at the expense of producers, musicians, writers, creators, and artists, by maximizing defendants' revenues through fraudulent means. As set forth herein, defendants benefited financially from their scheme to defraud plaintiff by intimidating plaintiff with threats of violence, threatening to eat plaintiff's face, displaying and distributing guns in plaintiff's presence, bragging about having law enforcement under control, bragging about murdering people, and bragging about bribing witnesses and jurors in the criminal case concerning the 1999 New York City nightclub shooting with Shine. Threats of isolation from the music and entertainment industry, parading powerful music industry executives such as defendants Lucien Charles Grange, Ethiopia Habtemariam, at his parties filled with sex workers, minors, and illegal drugs such as ecstasy, cocaine, GHB, ketamine, marijuana, and mushrooms. Threats of non-payment for work completed, fake promises of cash payments, $250,000, Producer of the Year Grammy Awards, and guaranteed access to future projects. A $20 million home on Star Island in Miami, which defendants would not have done but for the existence of the scheme. 183. The members of the RICO enterprise all share a common purpose: to enrich themselves financially and sexually at the expense of producers, musicians, writers, creators, and artists, by maximizing defendants' revenues through fraudulent means. As set forth herein, defendants benefited financially from their scheme to defraud plaintiff, including by making false representations that claimed that loyalty and obedience to Mr. Combs will result in cash payments, $250,000, Grammy Awards, access to future projects, access to famous celebrities, access to famous athletes, a $20 million home on Star Island in Miami, promises that plaintiff can increase his chances of securing cash payments, the $250,000, Grammy Awards, access to future projects, access to famous celebrities, access to famous athletes, a $20 million home on Star Island in Miami, by soliciting sex workers, by soliciting prostitutes, by engaging in homosexual acts, by distributing and transporting firearms, by distributing and transporting drugs, ecstasy, cocaine, GHB, ketamine, marijuana, and mushrooms, by involuntarily sleeping with sex workers in the presence of Mr. Combs, and by utilizing their talents and labor to produce music and other tangible goods and services without compensation, which defendants would not have done but for the existence of the scheme. 184. Upon information and belief, this RICO enterprise has existed for at least 20 years, dating back to the 1999 nightclub shooting in New York City, when Mr. Combs required his then-girlfriend, Jennifer Lopez, to transport his illegal firearm into the New York City nightclub. Mr. Combs forced his then-artist Shine to assume responsibility of several individuals. Mr. Combs used his power, money, and influence to bribe jurors and witnesses, such as the friend of the shooting victim, Natanya Rubin, who reported to law enforcement that she saw Mr. Combs and not Shine pull the trigger and shoot her friend in the face. Natanya Rubin later testified at Mr. Combs' criminal trial that she was tying her shoe and may not have seen who shot the gun. She later confessed that Mr. Combs paid her. 185. The RICO enterprise continued throughout the years, including during Mr. Combs' 10-year relationship with his girlfriend, Cassie Ventura. According to Ms. Ventura's civil complaint, the RICO enterprise continued in her relationship with Mr. Combs, forced her to carry his guns in her purse, forced her to engage in unwanted sexual acts with male prostitutes and sex workers, forced her to consume dangerous amounts of ecstasy, cocaine, GHB, ketamine, marijuana, and alcohol, and paying a member of his security team $5,000 to blow up the vehicle of Kid Cudi because he was jealous and insecure of their relationship. 186. The RICO enterprise continued from September 2022 to the present day, as evidenced by the hundreds of hours of video and audio recordings to plaintiff's possessions. Defendants Sean Combs, Justin Combs, Christina Coram, his assistants and staff all orchestrated, participated, managed, and executed the RICO enterprise by purchasing and distributing ecstasy, cocaine, GHB, ketamine, marijuana, and mushrooms, by purchase and distributing firearms, by requiring the solicitation of sexual encounters with prostitutes, sex workers, and minors, and by forcing artists, creatives, musicians, and producers to utilize their talents and labor to produce music and other tangible goods and service without compensation. The RICO enterprise has functioned as a continuing unit and maintains an ascertainable structure, separate and distinct from the pattern of racketeering activity. 187. The enterprise was characterized by the defendant's pattern of false representations and omissions made by defendants Sean Combs, Justin Combs, Christina Coram, and other current and former members of the defendant's associates and staff to defendants' artists, creatives, musicians, and producers. These false representations and omissions were designed to induce defendants' artists, creatives, musicians, and producers to utilize their talents and labor to produce music and other tangible goods and services without compensation, as well as the solicitation of sexual encounters with prostitutes, sex workers, and minors, and the purchasing and distribution of illegal firearms and drugs. 188. As part of this scheme, defendants required their artists, creatives, musicians, and producers to visit strip clubs wearing exclusive, authentic Bad Boy merchandise and to use the name and reputation of Mr. Combs to solicit sex workers and prostitutes. Additionally, Mr. Combs used the prospects of winning Grammy Awards, purchasing $20 million homes, participating in future projects, making $250,000 cash payments, and meeting influential music industry executives such as defendants Lucian Charles Grange and Ethiopia Habtemariam. This pattern of false representations was disseminated to artists, creatives, musicians, and producers who reside in California, Florida, New York, and around the country by defendants based in California and New York under the direction and on behalf of defendants in New York. The dissemination typically used interstate telephone wires, social media messages, and electronic mail. 189. The true nature of defendants' schemes was left undisclosed, was omitted, and or was affirmatively misrepresented, all to fraudulently increase defendants' profits, at least some of which were used to expand the enterprise, causing further injury to Plaintiff Jones and other unwitting artists, creatives, musicians, and producers. 190. Defendants profited from the enterprise, and Plaintiff Jones suffered because the enterprise diminished Plaintiff Jones' finances due to 13 months of non-payment and diminished Plaintiff Jones' health through consistent drugging and forced sexual encounters with prostitutes and sex workers. Defendants used the proceeds from this scheme to advance the scheme by funding and operating their marketing machine, including through the use of mail, social media, word of mouth, and interstate wires to sell the illusion that Mr. Combs was serious about the talents and skills of the artists, creatives, musicians, and producers, and wanted to use those skills to make music when nothing could be further from the truth. Defendants provided their artists, creatives, musicians, and producers with this misrepresentative information, including via email, all over interstate wireline communication systems, and obtaining free labor, the distribution of drugs and firearms, as well as prostitutes, sex workers, and minors. Defendants obtained revenue via wire transfers, documents, and banking transactions that were exchanged via electronic means over interstate wires, thereby growing the enterprise and causing further injury to Plaintiff Jones as described throughout. 191. The defendant's scheme was reasonably calculated to deceive Plaintiff Jones, artists, creatives, musicians, and producers of ordinary prudence and comprehension through the execution of their complex and illegal scheme to misrepresent the effectiveness of soliciting prostitutes, sex workers, and minors and distributing drugs and guns that did not, would not, and could not lead to securing Grammy Awards, purchasing $20 million homes, participating on future projects, $250,000 cash payments, and meeting influential music industry executives such as defendants Lucian Charles Grange and Ethiopia Habtemariam. Plaintiff Jones would not have lived with Mr. Combs for 13 months, missing birthdays, holidays, and family events, but for the illegal racketeering scheme operated by defendants. 192. Defendants each had the specific intent to participate in the overall RICO enterprise in the scheme to defraud Plaintiff Jones, and each participated in the enterprise as follows. 193. Defendants Lucy and Charles Grange, Ethiopia Habtemariam, Combs Global, Motown Records, Love Records, and Universal Music Group control and participate in the activities of the enterprise in a variety of ways as set forth herein, including but not limited to developing and marketing scores of writing camps and listening party services that are marketed to innocent, unassuming artists, creatives, musicians, and producers who are vulnerable and in seek of opportunities to work and share their craft. 194. Throughout the relevant period, defendants Lucy and Charles Grange, Ethiopia Habtemariam, Combs Global, Motown Records, Love Records, and Universal Music Group oversaw the activities of defendants Sean Combs, Justin Combs, and Christina Quorum, and other current and former members of the defendants' associates and staff. Collectively, individual defendants Lucy and Charles Grange, Ethiopia Habtemariam, Combs Global, Motown Records, Love Records, and Universal Music Group has an ethical obligation as respondent superior to supervise the actions and activities of the individual defendants. Defendants Lucy and Charles Grange, Ethiopia Habtemariam, Combs Global, Motown Records, Love Records, and Universal Music Group failed miserably to do so. Individual defendants relied on the mail, email, social media, and the telephone to distribute advertisements to secure artists, creatives, musicians, and producers whom they would promise Grammy awards, purchasing $20 million homes, participating on future projects, $250,000 cash payments, and meeting powerful music industry executives such as defendants Lucy and Charles Grange, Ethiopia Habtemariam. These advertisements originated from and were sent from defendants Lucy and Charles Grange, Ethiopia Habtemariam, Combs Global, Motown Records, Love Records, and Universal Music Group's office in the state of New York to consumers in New York and around the country, relying on the mail, email, social media, messenger, and telephone to distribute and interstate wires to disseminate the misleading information described herein, as well as to receive profits from the artists, creatives, musicians, and producers. 195. In connection with defendants acting from New York, these defendants used the mail and interstate wires to solicit Plaintiff Jones and other artists, creatives, musicians, and producers, and to use Plaintiff Jones and the artists, creatives, musicians, and producers to utilize their talents and labor to produce music and other tangible goods and services without compensation, as well as the solicitation of sexual encounters with prostitutes, sex workers, and minors, and the purchasing and distribution of illegal firearms and drugs. Each of these acts was undertaken with the knowledge and approval of all other defendants in furtherance of goals of their conspiracy. 196. Defendants Lucy and Charles Grange, Ethiopia Habtemariam, Combs Global, Motown Records, Love Records, and Universal Music Group directs, controls, and participates in the activities of the enterprise in a variety of ways as set forth herein, including as the employer, parent company, sponsor, and respondent superior of defendants Sean Combs, Justin Combs, Christina Quorum, and other current and former members of the defendants' associates and staff. Throughout the relevant period, defendants Lucy and Charles Grange, Ethiopia Habtemariam, Combs Global, Motown Records, Love Records, and Universal Music Group oversaw the marketing and soliciting of potential artists, creatives, musicians, and producers from their headquarters in New York, California, and Florida to consumers in New York, California, and Florida, and around the country, relying on the mail, email, social media, text messages, and WhatsApp messages to distribute interstate wires to disseminate the misleading information described herein, as well as to receive profits from the artists, creatives, musicians, and producers from their forced solicitation of sex workers and the solicitation of sexual encounters with prostitutes, sex workers, and minors, and the purchasing and distribution of illegal firearms and drugs. Each of these acts was undertaken with the knowledge and approval of all other defendants in furtherance of the goals of their conspiracy. 197. Robin Greenhill, the accountant, would ensure the wiring, fund transfers, and cash payments to sex workers. Frankie Santella, Moy Bond, Brendan Paul, and KK would also be responsible for ensuring payment to sex workers in cash. Young Miami, Jade, and Daphne Joy were paid a monthly fee to work as Mr. Combs' sex workers and received payment via wire transfer from Robin Greenhill, which outlined defendants' ongoing criminal operation. 198. During the 10 years preceding the filing of this action and to the present, all defendants did cooperate jointly and severally in the commission of 3 or more of the predicate acts that are itemized at 18 U.S.C. 1961 1A and B in violation of 18 U.S.C. 1962 D as described in this complaint. 199. Beginning at an exact date unknown to plaintiff, but within 10 years preceding the filing of this action, defendants have knowingly, willfully, and unlawfully participated in a pattern of racketeering activity that continues to this day. 200. The acts set below, racketeering acts, had the same pattern and purpose to defraud plaintiff for the benefit of defendants. Each racketeering act involved the same or similar method of commission and participants. 201. Without the repeated predicate acts, the ability to conduct their fraud using the mail and telecommunication wires and the money laundering, the defendant's business would not have succeeded. 202. The separate racketeering acts all relate to each other in that they were part of concerted actions by defendants to use the endorsement and channels of the enterprise to operate their businesses to fraudulently induce Plaintiff Jones and the artists, creatives, musicians, and producer to utilize their talents and labor to produce music and other tangible goods and services without compensation, as well as the solicitation of and sexual encounters with prostitutes, sex workers, and minors, and the purchasing and distribution of illegal firearms and drugs. 203. The separate racketeering acts all relate to each other in that they were part of concerted actions by defendants to use the endorsement and channels of the enterprise to operate their businesses to fraudulently induce Plaintiff Jones and the artists, creatives, musicians, and producers to utilize their talents and labor to produce music and other tangible goods and services without compensation, as well as the solicitation of and sexual encounters with prostitutes, sex workers, and minors, and the purchasing and distribution of illegal firearms and drugs. 204. The defendant's wrongful conduct has caused injury to Plaintiff Jones, remains a part of their ongoing business practices, and remains a continuing threat to Plaintiff Jones and the public. 205. Defendant's association with the enterprise enabled defendants to conduct, direct, control a pattern of fraudulent illegal activities over a substantial number of years, which continues to this day. 206. To further their goals, defendants working in concert engaged in various forms of criminal activity, including the solicitation of and sexual encounters with prostitutes, sex workers, and minors, and the purchasing and distribution of illegal firearms and drugs. 207. Defendants' ongoing pattern of racketeering activity has injured and continues to injure Plaintiff Jones. The defendant's pattern of forcing Plaintiff Jones and the artists, creatives, musicians, and producers to solicit sexual encounters with prostitutes, sex workers, and minors, and to purchase and distribute illegal firearms and drugs was the proximate cause of the injuries suffered by the plaintiff. Defendants committed multiple acts of mail fraud in violation of 18 U.S.C. 1341 in furtherance of the enterprise. 208. Defendants voluntarily and intentionally devised and participated in a scheme to defraud plaintiffs out of money in reliance on the mail. Defendants committed these acts with the intent to defraud Plaintiff Jones and the artists, creatives, musicians, and producers. 209. Defendants used the mail for the purpose of executing the fraudulent scheme herein. 210. Specifically, defendants agreed to each of the acts of mail fraud described throughout this complaint. In addition, defendants agreed to rely on the mail to secure wire frauds, cash payments from purchasers of the illegal firearms and drugs defendants required others to sell and distribute. 211. In furtherance of and for purposes of executing the above described fraudulent illegal course of conduct and scheme to defraud, defendants either individually or in combination with themselves used and caused to be used the U.S. mail by both placing and causing to be placed cash, letters, marketing materials, advertisements, agreements, and other matters in depositories, and by removing or causing to be removed letters and other mailable matters from depositories in violation of the mail fraud statute 18 U.S.C. 1341. 212. Defendants could not have furthered their fraud without the use of the mail. For example, defendants sought to acquire wire transfers, cash payments, and to utilize their talents and labor to produce music and other tangible goods and services without compensation. Defendants also required the mail to distribute misleading advertisements to various states, including New York,
For these reasons, the use of mail to conduct fraudulent activity was necessary and inevitable. Defendants committed multiple acts of wire fraud in violation of 18 U.S.C. 1343 in furtherance of the enterprise. 213. Defendants voluntarily and intentionally devised and participated in a scheme to defraud plaintiff out of money in reliance on the mail. Defendants committed these acts with the intent to defraud plaintiff Jones and the artists, creatives, musicians, and producers. 214. Specifically, defendants agreed to each of the acts of wire fraud described throughout this complaint. In addition, defendants agreed to rely on interstate wires to disseminate funds and to submit payments to sex workers and prostitutes, as well as to transfer payment for the distribution and procurement of drugs and guns. Defendants illegally acquired wire transfers, money transfers, credit cards, and bank cards via search engines and other online platforms to further their collective goal of furthering their RICO enterprise. Defendants knew that these online purchases were illegally made. 215. Additionally, defendants agreed that defendants should facilitate these fraudulent purchases over interstate wires in furtherance of the fraud. Sex workers and prostitutes nationwide have received payments from the defendants. 216. In furtherance of and for purposes of executing the above described fraudulent and illegal course of conduct and scheme or artifice to defraud, defendants either individually or in combination with themselves used or caused to be used interstate wire communications to transmit or disseminate false, fraudulent, and misleading communications and information in violation of the wire fraud statute, 18 U.S.C. 1343. 217. Defendants could not have furthered their fraud without the ability to use telecommunications to share information with clients and retailers nationwide. Because defendants needed to communicate with clients and retailers around the country, the use of interstate telecommunication wires to conduct the fraudulent activity was necessary and inevitable. 218. Plaintiffs have been damaged in their business or property because defendants violated 18 U.S.C. 1962A, C through D, and therefore he is entitled to recover the damages and other remedies enumerated therein. 219. Defendants' acts or omissions were actuated by actual malice and or a willful and wanton disregard for the consequences suffered by the plaintiff and or with knowledge of a high degree of probability of harm to the plaintiff and reckless indifference to the consequences of their acts or omissions. 220. Compensatory damages alone will be insufficient to deter such conduct in the future. There needs to be a criminal referral to the United States Justice Department as well as to the State's Attorney General Office. Wherefore, plaintiff requests that the court issue an order and grant judgment to the plaintiff as follows. A. Granting plaintiff statutory common law and punitive damages and applicable pre- and post-judgment interest and full recompense for damages. B. Entering judgment according to the declaratory relief sought. C. Granting plaintiffs such other and further relief, including without limitation, injunctive and equitable relief as the court deems just in all the circumstances. And D. Granting plaintiff an incentive or service award reflective of the work done in prosecuting this action, the time spent, the effort, and hard costs invested, and results obtained, in light of the court's judgment, informed by awards and other similar cases of comparable difficulty and complexity. Second cause of action, sexual assault and sexual harassment against Mr. Combs. 221. Mr. Jones incorporates by reference all preceding paragraphs and realleges them as if set forth fully herein. 222. As described above, Mr. Combs frightened and placed plaintiff in apprehension of harm when he physically and sexually assaulted him from October 2022 to October 2023 in Mr. Combs' home in Miami, New York, United States Virgin Islands, and Los Angeles. 223. Mr. Combs forcibly touched and attempted or threatened to touch plaintiff's intimate areas and or touch plaintiff with his own intimate body parts. 224. Mr. Combs violently gripped and palmed Mr. Jones' anus and crotch without consent. Mr. Combs forced Mr. Jones to work in Mr. Combs' bathroom and watched Mr. Combs as he showered. Mr. Combs forced Mr. Jones to work in the studio while Mr. Combs stripped naked to get his body massaged. Mr. Combs forced Mr. Jones to work while Mr. Combs walked around naked. 225. As a result of Mr. Combs' conduct, Plaintiff has suffered and continues to suffer harm, including physical injury, severe emotional distress, humiliation, anxiety, and other consequential damages for which he is entitled to an award of monetary damages and other relief. The conduct of Mr. Combs described above was willful, wanton, and malicious. At all relevant times, Mr. Combs acted with conscious disregard for plaintiff's rights and feelings, acted with the knowledge of or with reckless disregard for the fact that his conduct was certain to cause injury and or humiliation to plaintiff, and intended to cause fear, physical injury, and or pain and suffering to plaintiff by virtue of the foregoing. Plaintiff is entitled to recover punitive damages. There's a footnote for in full recompense for damages. It's 22. It says damages shall include but not be limited to all damages permitted under the New Jersey Racketeer Influenced and Corrupt Organization Act. Third cause of action. California's bystander negligent infliction of emotional distress against Mr. Combs and defendant Justin Combs. 227. Mr. Jones incorporates by reference all preceding paragraphs and realleges them as if set forth fully herein. 228. Mr. Jones brings this claim against Mr. Combs and J. Combs for the CRS shooting of G. 229. The elements of bystander NIEDR 1 is closely related to the injury victim. 2 is present at the scene of the injury-producing event at the time it occurs and is then aware that it is causing injury to the victim. And 3, as a result, suffers serious emotional distress, a reaction beyond that which would be anticipated in a disinterested witness and which is not an abnormal response to the circumstances. 230. As detailed above, Mr. Jones was 2 feet away from G as either J. Combs or Mr. Combs shot him multiple times in the restroom with CRS. As detailed above, Mr. Jones was the only individual that aided G as he laid on the bathroom floor in a fetal position bleeding out. As detailed above, Mr. Combs and J. Combs orchestrated a cover-up and through Fahim Muhammad lied to the LAPD and forced Mr. Jones and all the other attendees of the writers' camp to lie to the police as well. Mr. Combs and J. Combs knew that they shot G in the restroom and that G was shot as he was leaving the studio. 231. Mr. Combs and J. Combs' intentional deception caused a delay in G receiving immediate medical care. As the ambulance parked 3 blocks away from CRS out of fear that there was an active shooting, Mr. Jones had to run down the block and convince them that the shooting had ended. 232. These events traumatized Mr. Jones. It caused Mr. Jones to suffer from insomnia, PTSD, severe anxiety, and depression. Additionally, the fear and silence from the remaining witnesses aided in the reinforcement of Mr. Combs' statement that he is untouchable. 233. As a result of Mr. Combs and J. Combs' conduct, Plaintiff Jones has suffered and continues to suffer harm, including severe emotional distress, anxiety, and other consequential damages for which he is entitled to an award of monetary damages and other relief. 234. The conduct of Mr. Combs and J. Combs described above was willful, wanton, and malicious. At all relevant times, Mr. Combs and J. Combs acted with conscious disregard for plaintiff's rights and feelings, acted with knowledge of or with reckless disregard for the fact that their conduct was certain to cause injury to plaintiff and intended to cause fear, physical injury, and or pain and suffering to plaintiff. By virtue of the foregoing, plaintiff is entitled to recover punitive damages. Fourth cause of action, sexual assault against Jane Doe 1, Young Miami's cousin. 235. Mr. Jones incorporates by reference all preceding paragraphs and realleges them as if set forth fully herein. 236. As described above, Jane Doe 1 frightened and placed plaintiff in an apprehension of harm when she physically and sexually assaulted him on Thanksgiving Day 2022 in Mr. Combs' home in Miami, Florida. 237. Jane Doe 1 forcibly touched and attempted and or threatened to touch plaintiff's intimate areas and or touched plaintiff with her own intimate body parts. Jane Doe 1 used her mouth and performed oral sex on plaintiff while he was urinating in the restroom. Plaintiff fought her off while Mr. Combs and his associates sat outside loudly laughing. Jane Doe 1 then followed Mr. Jones outside of the restroom and began undressing in front of Mr. Combs and his associates, straddled Mr. Jones, and attempted to have forced sexual intercourse with him. 238. As a result of Jane Doe 1's conduct, plaintiff has suffered and continues to suffer harm, including physical injury, severe emotional distress, humiliation, anxiety, and other consequential damages for which he is entitled to an award of monetary damages and other relief. 239. The conduct of Jane Doe 1 described above was willful, wanton, and malicious. At all relevant times, Jane Doe 1 acted with conscious disregard for plaintiff's rights and feelings, acted with knowledge of and or with reckless disregard for the fact that her conduct was certain to cause injury and or humiliation to plaintiff, and intended to cause fear, physical injury, and or pain and suffering to plaintiff. By virtue of the foregoing, plaintiff is entitled to recover punitive damages. Fifth cause of action. Premises liability for the sexual assault committed by Jane Doe 1, Young Miami's cousin, against Mr. Combs. 240. Mr. Jones incorporates by reference all preceding paragraphs and realleges them as if set forth fully herein. 241. Mr. Jones was sexually assaulted by Jane Doe 1 in Miami on Thanksgiving 2022. Mr. Combs was present while Mr. Jones was being assaulted by Jane Doe 1. Mr. Jones was legally on the premises as a guest and invitee of Mr. Combs. Jane Doe 1 was legally on the premises as a guest and invitee of Mr. Combs. Mr. Combs owned the premises and had dominion and control over the premises where Mr. Jones was harmed. Mr. Combs had dominion and control over the actions of Jane Doe 1 and failed to step in and stop Jane Doe 1 from sexually assaulting Mr. Jones. 242. As the owner of the property, Mr. Combs had a duty to protect Mr. Jones from the harm he suffered at the hands of Jane Doe 1. Mr. Combs breached his duty when he failed to stop Jane Doe 1 from sexually assaulting Mr. Jones. In furtherance of this breach, Mr. Combs was laughing and encouraging Jane Doe 1 to continue her assault of Mr. Jones. Mr. Jones has suffered immensely because of Mr. Combs' intentional breach of his duty to him. 243. As a result of Mr. Combs' breach of his duty, Mr. Jones has suffered and continues to suffer harm, including severe emotional distress, anxiety, and other consequential damages for which he is entitled to an award of monetary damages and other relief. 244. The conduct of Mr. Combs described above was willful, wanton, and malicious. At all relevant times, Mr. Combs acted with conscious disregard for plaintiff's rights and feelings, acted with knowledge of or reckless disregard for the fact that their conduct was certain to cause injury to plaintiff and intended to cause fear, physical injury, and or pain and suffering to plaintiff. By virtue of the foregoing, plaintiff is entitled to recover punitive damages. Sixth cause of action. Premises liability for the sexual assault committed by Cuba Gooding Jr. against Mr. Combs. 245. Mr. Jones incorporates by reference all preceding paragraphs and realleges them as if set forth fully herein. 246. Here, Mr. Jones was sexually assaulted by Cuba Gooding Jr. on a yacht rented by Mr. Combs in the U.S. Virgin Islands in January 2023. Mr. Combs was present while Mr. Jones was being assaulted by Cuba Gooding Jr. Mr. Jones was legally on the premises as a guest and invitee of Mr. Combs. Cuba Gooding Jr. was legally on the premises as a guest and invitee of Mr. Combs. Mr. Combs owned, through renting, the premises and had dominion and control over the premises where Mr. Jones was harmed. Mr. Combs had dominion and control over the actions of Cuba Gooding Jr. and failed to step in and stop Cuba Gooding Jr. from assaulting Mr. Jones. 247. As the owner of the property, Mr. Combs had a duty to protect Mr. Jones from the harm he suffered at the hands of Cuba Gooding Jr. Mr. Combs breached his duty when he failed to stop Cuba Gooding Jr. from sexually assaulting Mr. Jones. In furtherance of this breach, Mr. Combs encouraged Cuba Gooding Jr. to continue his assault of Mr. Jones when he said that Cuba Gooding Jr. should privately get to know Mr. Jones better. Mr. Jones has suffered immensely because of Mr. Combs' intentional breach of his duty to him. 248. As a result of Mr. Combs' breach of his duty, Mr. Jones has suffered and continues to suffer harm, including severe emotional distress, anxiety, and other consequential damages for which he is entitled to an award of monetary damages and other relief. 249. The conduct of Mr. Combs described above was willful, wanton, and malicious. At all relevant times, Mr. Combs acted with conscious disregard for plaintiff's rights and feelings, acted with the knowledge of or with reckless disregard for the fact that their conduct was certain to cause injury to plaintiff and intended to cause fear, physical injury, and or pain and suffering to plaintiff. By virtue of the foregoing, plaintiff is entitled to recover punitive damages. Seventh cause of action, Trafficking and Victims Protection Act against defendants Sean Combs, Justin Combs, Christina Coram, and Combs Global. 250. Mr. Jones incorporates by reference all preceding paragraphs and realleges them as if set forth fully herein. Defendants Sean Combs, Justin Combs, Christina Coram, and Combs Global knowingly and intentionally participated in, perpetrated, assisted, supported, facilitated a sex trafficking venture that was in and affecting interstate and foreign commerce together and with others in violation of 18 U.S.C. 1591 A1. 252. Among other things, defendants Sean Combs, Justin Combs, Christina Coram, and Combs Global knowingly and intentionally recruited, enticed, provided, obtained, advertised, and solicited by various means Mr. Jones as well as other class members, knowing that defendants Sean Combs, Justin Combs, Christina Coram, and Combs Global would use means of force, threats of force, fraud, coercion, and a combination of such means to cause Mr. Jones as well as others, some of whom were under the age of 17, to engage in commercial sex acts. 253. Defendants Sean Combs, Justin Combs, Christina Coram, and Combs Global and its employees had actual knowledge that they were perpetrating and facilitating Mr. Combs' sexual abuse and sex trafficking conspiracy to recruit, solicit, entice, coerce, harbor, transport, obtain, and provide Mr. Jones as well as others who were under the age of 17 in the commercial sex acts through the means of force, threats of force, fraud, abuse of process, and coercion. 254. Despite such knowledge, defendants Sean Combs, Justin Combs, Christina Coram, and Combs Global intentionally paid for, facilitated, perpetrated, and participated in Mr. Combs' violations of 18 U.S.C. 1591 A1, which defendants Sean Combs, Justin Combs, Christina Coram, and Combs Global knew and were in reckless disregard of the fact that Mr. Combs would coerce, defraud, and force Mr. Jones to engage in commercial sex acts. 255. Defendants Sean Combs, Justin Combs, Christina Coram, and Combs Global actions were in and affecting interstate and foreign commerce, including its music, distributing, and publishing activities, which were in and affecting interstate and foreign commerce. 256. By taking the concrete steps alleged in this complaint, defendants Sean Combs, Justin Combs, Christina Coram, and Combs Global knowingly participated in sex trafficking and furthered the Combs sex trafficking venture. The concrete steps constituted taking part in the sex trafficking venture and were necessary for its success. The concrete steps constituted active engagement by defendants Sean Combs, Justin Combs, Christina Coram, and Combs Global in Mr. Combs' sex trafficking venture. Defendants Sean Combs, Justin Combs, Christina Coram, and Combs Global knew that its active engagement would lead to and cause coercive commercial sex trafficking. 257. As part of perpetrating TVPA violations between on or about September 12, 2022 and through about November 2023, defendants Sean Combs, Justin Combs, Christina Coram, and Combs Global concealed its delivery of hundreds of thousands of dollars in cash to Mr. Combs and his associates. 258. As part of perpetrating TVPA violations, defendants Sean Combs, Justin Combs, Christina Coram, and Combs Global also willfully failed to file required taxes with the federal government. 259. Defendants Sean Combs, Justin Combs, Christina Coram, and Combs Global affirmative conduct was committed knowing and in reckless disregard of the facts that Mr. Combs would use cash and the financial support provided by defendants Love Records, Motown Records, and the Universal Music Group as a means of defrauding, forcing, and coercing sex acts from Plaintiff Jones as well as others. Defendants Sean Combs, Justin Combs, Christina Coram, and Combs Global's conduct was outrageous and intentional. On or about January 2023, Justin Combs engaged in a freak-off session on a yacht with his father and sex workers. 260. Defendants Sean Combs, Justin Combs, Christina Coram, and Combs Global, knowing and intentional conduct has caused Mr. Jones serious harm, including, without limitation, physical, psychological, emotional, financial, and reputational harm. 261. Defendants Sean Combs, Justin Combs, and Christina Coram, and Combs Global, knowing and intentional conduct has caused Mr. Jones harm that is sufficiently serious under all the surrounding circumstances to compel a reasonable person of the same background and in the same circumstances to perform or to continue performing commercial sexual activity in order to avoid incurring that harm. 262. This case does not involve mere fraud. Instead, defendants Sean Combs, Justin Combs, Christina Coram, and Combs Global's criminal conduct in perpetrating TVPA violations was outrageous and intentional because it was in deliberate furtherance of a widespread and dangerous criminal sex trafficking organization. Defendants Sean Combs, Justin Combs, Christina Coram, and Combs Global criminal conduct also evinced a high degree of moral turpitude and demonstrated such wanton dishonesty as to imply a criminal indifference to civil obligations. Defendants Sean Combs, Justin Combs, Christina Coram, and Combs' global criminal conduct was directed specifically at Mr. Jones, who was the victim of Mr. Combs' sexual abuse and sex trafficking harassment. 263. Defendants Sean Combs, Justin Combs, Christina Coram, and Combs' global outrageous and intentional conduct in this case is part of a pattern and practice of defendants Sean Combs, Justin Combs, Christina Coram, and Combs Global profiting by undertaking illegal, high-risk, high-reward actions. 264. By virtue of these knowing and intentional violations of 18 U.S.C. 1591 A1, 1595, defendants Sean Combs, Justin Combs, Christina Coram, and Combs Global is liable to Mr. Jones for the damages they sustained and reasonable attorney's fees. 265. By virtue of these intentional and outrageous violations of 18 U.S.C. 1591 A1, 1595, defendants Sean Combs, Justin Combs, Christina Coram is liable to Mr. Jones. 8. Cause of action. California premise liability and adequate or negligent security against defendants LR, MR, UMG, CRS, and Sean Combs. 266. Mr. Jones incorporates by reference all preceding paragraphs and realleges them as if set forth fully herein. 267. At all times herein mentioned, defendants LR, MR, UMG, CRS, and Sean Combs acted in the course and scope of their agency, employment, and representation of each other, and with the knowledge, consent, direction, approval, and ratification of each other's act and omissions and conduct on or about September 12, 2022, at the Chalice Recording Studios located at 845 Highland Avenue, Los Angeles, California, 90038, did so negligently, carelessly, and without due care, regard, and concern for the rights, safety, and health of the plaintiff, in regard to such premise, did so control, own, supervise, manage, lease, and have responsibility for the safety of plaintiff and adequate security, security personnel, and security devices of the CRS. 268. At the aforementioned time and place, defendants LR, MR, UMG, CRS, and Sean Combs, and each of them negligently maintained, managed, controlled, and operated the Chalice Recording Studios in that they did not maintain and provide adequate security for the plaintiff or other artists, producers, and songwriters and creatives who attended Sean Combs' Love album writers camp. Defendants knew, or in the exercise of reasonable care, should have known, security was required and necessary, and the lack of such security could constitute a dangerous condition and unreasonable risk of harm of which plaintiff was at all times herein mentioned unaware. Defendants LR, MR, UMG, CRS, and Sean Combs had security check the songwriters, producers, and artists, but neglected to search Justin Combs and Sean Combs for the possession of firearms when they entered CRS. Defendants LR, MR, UMG, CRS, and Sean Combs negligently failed to take steps to either provide adequate security and make the condition safe or warn plaintiff of the dangerous condition, all of which caused plaintiff to suffer injuries. 269. As a proximate result of the negligence of defendants in each of them, plaintiff was hurt and injured in his health, strength, and activity, sustaining injuries to their nervous system and person, all of which injuries have caused and continue to cause plaintiffs great mental, physical, and nervous pain and suffering. As a result of each injuries, plaintiff has suffered general damages in an amount according to proof. 270. As a further proximate result of the negligence of defendants, plaintiff has incurred and will continue to incur medical and related expenses in an amount according to proof. Wherefore, plaintiff pray for judgment against defendants, and each of them as follows. A. General damages according to proof. B. For actual medical expense incurred. C. For future medical expenses according to proof. D. For loss of earning. E. For interest according to law. For F. For cost of suit incurred herein. And G. For such other and further relief as the court may deem just and proper. Ninth cause of action. Aiding, abetting, and inducing a sex trafficking venture in violation of the Trafficking Victims Protection Act, 18 U.S.C. 2, 1591 A1 and 2, 1595, against defendants Lucian Charles Grange, Ethiopia Habtemariam, Motown Records, Love Records, Universal Music Group. 271. Mr. Jones incorporates by reference all preceding paragraphs and realleges them as if set forth fully herein. 272. Defendants Lucy and Charles Grange, Ethiopia Haptemariam, Motown Records, Love Records, Universal Music Group aided, abetted, and induced Sean Combs' sex trafficking venture that was in and affecting interstate and foreign commerce together and with others in violation of 18 U.S.C. 2, 1591 A1 and A2. 273. The crimes that defendants Lucy and Charles Grange, Ethiopia Haptemariam, Motown Records, Love Records, Universal Music Group aided and abetted are 1. Mr. Combs' perpetrating of coercive sex trafficking in violation of 18 U.S.C. 1591 A1 and 2. Mr. Combs' co-conspirators knowingly benefiting from coercive sex trafficking in violation of 18 U.S.C. 1591 A2. These crimes were in and affecting interstate and foreign commerce. 274. Mr. Combs' co-conspirators benefited financially and received things of value from their participation in the Combs sex trafficking venture, including payments and other compensation from Mr. Combs. The co-conspirators who benefited financially include defendants J. Combs, Coram, and her direct reports, Brendan Paul, Frankie Santella, and Moy Bond. 275. Under 18 U.S.C. 2, defendants Lucy and Charles Grange, Ethiopia Haptemariam, Motown Records, Love Records, Universal Music Group are punishable as a principal under 18 U.S.C. 1591 A1 and A2, and thereby committed and perpetrated violations of Chapter 77, Title 18 U.S. Code when it aided, abetted, counseled, commanded, induced, and procured Combs and his co-conspirators' sex trafficking venture and sex trafficking of Plaintiff Jones as well as other underage persons. 276. Under 18 U.S.C. 2, defendants Lucy and Charles Grange, Ethiopia Haptemariam, Motown Records, Love Records, Universal Music Group committed and perpetrated crimes in violation of 18 U.S.C. 1591 A1 and A2 by aiding and abetting, inducing, and procuring Combs and his co-conspirators' sex trafficking venture and the sex trafficking of Mr. Jones. As a consequence, Mr. Jones is a victim of defendants J. Combs, Coram, and her direct reports, Brendan Paul, Frankie Santella, and Moy Bond criminally aided and abetted in inducing Combs and his co-conspirator violations of 18 U.S.C. 1591 A1 and A2. 277. Defendants J. Combs, Coram, and her direct reports Brendan Paul, Frankie Santella, and Moy Bond itself directly committed and perpetrated violations of Chapter 77, Title 18 U.S. Code, including 18 U.S.C. 1591 A1 and A2 by aiding and abetting and inducing the sex trafficking venture and the sex trafficking of Plaintiff Jones. Defendants J. Combs, Coram, and her direct reports Brendan Paul, Frankie Santella, and Moy Bond themselves directly violated Chapter 77 by committing and perpetrating these violations. 278. Among other things, defendants J. Combs, Coram, and her direct reports Brendan Paul, Frankie Santella, and Moy Bond aided, abetted, and induced Combs and his co-conspirators' sex trafficking venture and sex trafficking of Plaintiff Jones, knowing that Combs and his co-conspirators would use means of force, threats of force, fraud, coercion, and a combination of such means to cause Mr. Jones, some of whom were under the age of 18, to engage in commercial sex acts. 279. By aiding and abetting and inducing Mr. Combs and his co-conspirators' sex trafficking venture and sex trafficking of plaintiff, defendants J. Combs, Coram, and her direct reports Brendan Paul, Frankie Santella, and Moy Bond benefited both financially and by receiving things of value from participating in Combs' sex trafficking venture. 280. Defendants J. Combs, Coram, and her direct reports Brendan Paul, Frankie Santella, and Moy Bond and its employees had actual knowledge that they were aiding, abetting, and inducing Combs and his co-conspirators' sexual abuse and sex trafficking conspiracy to recruit, solicit, entice, coerce, harbor, transport, obtain, and provide Mr. Jones as well as others into commercial sex acts through the means of force, threats of force, fraud, abusive process, and coercion. Defendants knew and should have known that Mr. Combs had engaged in acts in violation of the TVPA. 281. Despite such knowledge, defendants Lucy and Charles Grange, Ethiopia Haptemariam, Motown Records, Love Records, Universal Music Group intentionally paid for and aided and abetted and induced Combs' violation of 18 U.S.C. 1591 A1 and A2, which constituted perpetrating violations of those laws under 18 U.S.C. 2. Defendants Lucy and Charles Grange, Ethiopia Habtemariam, Motown Records, Love Records, Universal Music Group knew and acted in reckless disregard of the fact that Combs would coerce, defraud, and force Mr. Jones to engage in commercial sex acts. 282. Defendants Lucy and Charles Grange, Ethiopia Habtemariam, Motown Records, Love Records, Universal Music Group's affirmative conduct of aiding, abetting, and inducing Combs' violation was committed knowingly and in reckless disregard for the facts that Mr. Combs would use cash and financial support provided by defendants Lucy and Charles Grange, Ethiopia Habtemariam, Motown Records, Love Records, Universal Music Group as a means of defrauding, forcing, and coercing sex acts from Mr. Jones. Defendants Lucy and Charles Grange, Ethiopia Habtemariam, Motown Records, Love Records, Universal Music Group's conduct was outrageous and intentional. 283. Defendants Lucy and Charles Grange, Ethiopia Habtemariam, Motown Records, Love Records, Universal Music Group's knowing and intentional conduct of aiding, abetting, and inducing Combs' violation has caused Mr. Jones serious harm, including, without limitation, physical, psychological, emotional, financial, and reputational harm. 284. Defendants Lucy and Charles Grange, Ethiopia Habtemariam, Motown Records, Love Records, Universal Music Group's knowing and intentional conduct of aiding and abetting and inducing Combs' violations has caused Mr. Jones harm that is sufficiently serious under all the surrounding circumstance to compel a reasonable person of the same background and in the same circumstances to perform or to continue performing commercial sexual activity and in order to avoid incurring that harm. 285. This case does not involve mere fraud. Instead, defendants' criminal conduct in aiding, abetting, and inducing Combs' violations of the TVPA was outrageous and intentional because it was in deliberate furtherance of a widespread and dangerous criminal sex trafficking organization. Defendants Lucy and Charles Grange, Ethiopia Habtemariam, Motown Records, Love Records, and Universal Music Group's criminal conduct also evinced a criminal indifference to civil obligations. Defendants Lucy and Charles Grange, Ethiopia Habtemariam, Motown Records, Love Records, Universal Music Group's criminal conduct was directed specifically at Mr. Jones, who was the victim of Mr. Combs' sexual abuse and sex trafficking organization. Defendants Lucy and Charles Grange, Ethiopia Habtemariam, Motown Records, Love Records, Universal Music Group's outrageous and intentional conduct in this case is part of a pattern and practice of defendants Lucy and Charles Grange, Ethiopia Habtemariam, Motown Records, Love Records, Universal Music Group profiting by undertaking illegal high-risk, high-reward sponsorships and partnerships. 287. By virtue of these knowing and intentional violations of 18 U.S.C. 1591A1, 1595, defendants Lucy and Charles Grange, Ethiopia Habtemariam, Motown Records, Love Records, Universal Music Group is liable to Mr. Jones for the damages he sustained and reasonable attorney's fees. 288. By virtue of these intentional and outrageous violations of 18 U.S.C. 1591A1, 1595, defendants Lucy and Charles Grange, Ethiopia Habtemariam, Motown Records, Love Records, Universal Music Group is liable to Mr. Jones for punitive damages. 10th cause of action, Nide for sexual assault against defendant Jane Doe 1, Young Miami's cousin. Mr. Jones incorporates by reference all preceding paragraphs and realleges them as if set forth fully herein. Jane Doe 1's conduct creates an unreasonable risk of causing emotional distress to plaintiff, and Jane Doe 1 knew or should have known that such conduct was likely to result in emotional distress that might and or likely would cause illness or bodily harm. 291. Plaintiff's emotional distress was foreseeable to Jane Doe 1. 292. As a direct and proximate result of the negligent conduct of Jane Doe 1, plaintiff suffered and will continue to suffer severe emotional distress. 293. Jane Doe 1's conduct was wanton, malicious, willful, and or cruel, entitling the plaintiff to punitive damages. 11th cause of action, Nide for sexual assault against Mr. Combs. 294. Mr. Jones incorporates by reference all preceding paragraphs and realleges them as if set forth fully herein. 295. Mr. Combs' conduct created an unreasonable risk of causing emotional distress to plaintiff, and Mr. Combs knew or should have known that such conduct would likely result in emotional distress that might and or likely would cause illness or bodily harm. 296. Plaintiff's emotional distress was foreseeable to Mr. Combs. 297. As a direct and proximate result of the negligent conduct of Mr. Combs, plaintiff suffered and will continue to suffer severe emotional distress. 298. Mr. Combs' conduct was wanton, malicious, willful, and or cruel, entitling the plaintiff to punitive damages. 12th cause of action. IIED for sexual assault. Defendant Jane Doe 1, Young Miami's cousin. 299. Mr. Jones incorporates by reference all preceding paragraphs and realleges them as if set forth fully herein. 300. Jane Doe 1 engaged in conduct toward plaintiff that is extreme and outrageous to exceed the bonds of decency in a civilized society, namely by subjecting him to sexual assault and misconduct. 301. The sexual assault and misconduct by Jane Doe were extreme and outrageous conduct that shocks the conscience. 302. These actions were taken with the intent to cause or disregard for the substantial probability of causing severe emotional distress. 303. As a direct and proximate result of Jane Doe 1's extreme and outrageous conduct, plaintiff has suffered a severe emotional distress. 304. The defendant's conduct was wanton, malicious, willful, and or cruel, entitling the plaintiff to punitive damages. 13th cause of action, IIED, for sexual assault against Mr. Combs. 305. Mr. Jones incorporates by reference all preceding paragraphs and realleges them as if set forth fully herein. 306. Mr. Combs engaged in conduct toward plaintiff that is extreme and outrageous to exceed the bonds of decency in a civilized society, namely by subjecting him to sexual assault and misconduct. 307. The sexual assault and misconduct by Mr. Combs were extreme and outrageous conduct that shocks the conscience. 308. These actions were taken with the intent to cause or disregard for the substantial probability of causing severe emotional distress. 309. As a direct and proximate result of Mr. Combs' extreme and outrageous conduct, plaintiff has suffered severe emotional distress. 310. The defendant's conduct was wanton, malicious, willful, and or cruel, entitling the plaintiff to punitive damages. 14th cause of action. Knowing beneficiary in a sex trafficking venture in violation of the Trafficking Victims Protection Act, 18 U.S.C. 1591 A2 1595, against defendants Lucian Charles Grange, Ethiopia Habtemariam, Motown Records, Love Records, and Universal Music Group. 311. Mr. Jones incorporates by reference all preceding paragraphs and realleges them as if set forth fully herein. 312. Defendants Lucian Charles Grange, Ethiopia Habtemariam, Motown Records, Love Records, and Universal Music Group knowingly and intentionally benefited financially and by receiving things of value from participating in, assisting, supporting, and facilitating an illegal coercive sex trafficking venture that was in and affecting interstate and foreign commerce, together and with others, in violation of 18 U.S.C. 1591 A2. 313. Defendants Lucian Charles Grange, Ethiopia Habtemariam, Motown Records, Love Records, and Universal Music Group took many concrete steps to aid and participate in Mr. Combs' sex trafficking venture. Among the concrete steps that defendants Lucian Charles Grange, Ethiopia Habtemariam, Motown Records, Love Records, and Universal Music Group took to aid Mr. Combs was providing vast sums of cash, which made the sex trafficking venture possible. Providing Mr. Combs with large sums of U.S. currency caused defendants Lucian Charles Grange, Ethiopia Habtemariam, Motown Records, Love Records, and Universal Music Group to receive financial benefits. Defendants Lucian Charles Grange, Ethiopia Habtemariam, Motown Records, Love Records, and Universal Music Group's willingness to provide large amounts of cash to Mr. Combs was the quid pro quo for receiving financial benefits from Mr. Combs. 314. The cash that defendants Lucian Charles Grange, Ethiopia Habtemariam, Motown Records, Love Records, and Universal Music Group provided was necessary for Mr. Combs to coerce Plaintiff Jones to engage in commercial sex acts. The cash directly formed part of the commercial nature of the sex acts. The cash was also a necessary and required part of Mr. Combs' recruitment of Plaintiff Jones, as well as other sex workers, prostitutes, and underage minors. By providing cash that defendants Lucian Charles Grange, Ethiopia Habtemariam, Motown Records, Love Records, and Universal Music Group knew would be used to fund the sex trafficking venture, defendants Lucian Charles Grange, Ethiopia Habtemariam, Motown Records, Love Records, and Universal Music Group actively participated in the recruitment of victims of the venture. 315. The cash that defendants Lucy and Charles Grange, Ethiopia Habtemariam, Motown Records, Love Records, and Universal Music Group provided went far beyond providing routine sponsorship, partnership, and employer compensation for a subordinate. It was far from routine for defendants Lucy and Charles Grange, Ethiopia Habtemariam, Motown Records, Love Records, and Universal Music Group to provide substantial sums of cash per year to Mr. Combs, who did not have an apparent legitimate need for such extravagant sums. The sheer number of listening parties, yacht parties, and nighttime writer camps after parties, which defendants Lucy and Charles Grange, Ethiopia Habtemariam, Motown Records, Love Records, and Universal Music Group sponsored, went far beyond normal for the music industry. Defendants Lucy and Charles Grange, Ethiopia Habtemariam, Motown Records, Love Records, and Universal Music Group knew or should have known that they were feeding Mr. Combs' sexual deviancy. Moreover, the circumstances in which Mr. Combs was requesting such large amounts were far from routine and should have raised numerous red flags, taking you well outside routine circumstances. 316. Defendants Lucy and Charles Grange, Ethiopia Habtemariam, Motown Records, Love Records, and Universal Music Groups providing large sums of cash to Mr. Combs under the circumstances of this case was entirely inconsistent with the ordinary duties of a record label, music group, publishing partner, or as an employee. 317. The reason that defendants Lucy and Charles Grange, Ethiopia Habtemariam, Motown Records, Love Records, and Universal Music Group ignored the numerous red flags about Mr. Combs was to receive financial benefits from Mr. Combs and his sex trafficking venture. Defendants Lucy and Charles Grange, Ethiopia Habtemariam, Motown Records, and Love Records, and Universal Music Group knew that it would gain far from routine financial benefits by ignoring the red flags associated with Mr. Combs and by participating in his sex trafficking venture. A. Among the concrete steps that defendants Lucy and Charles Grange, Ethiopia Habtemariam, Motown Records, Love Records, and Universal Music Group took to aid and participate in the Combs sex trafficking venture were opening up numerous lines of credit for Mr. Combs' production of the Love album, his related entities, and associates. By opening these lines of credits and by consistently sponsoring his freak-off parties, defendants Lucy and Charles Grange, Ethiopia Habtemariam, Motown Records, Love Records, and Universal Music Group received many benefits from participating in Mr. Combs' venture. The sponsoring of these events was affirmative conduct that caused defendants Lucy and Charles Grange, Ethiopia Habtemariam, Motown Records, Love Records, and Universal Music Group to receive those benefits. B. Among the concrete steps that defendants Lucy and Charles Grange, Ethiopia Habtemariam, Motown Records, Love Records, and Universal Music Group took to aid the Combs sex trafficking venture between about 2000 and continuing through about November 2023, defendants Lucy and Charles Grange, Ethiopia Habtemariam, Motown Records, Love Records, and Universal Music Group concealed its delivery of vast sums of cash, likely millions of dollars, to Mr. Combs and his associates in order to benefit from the Combs sex trafficking venture. Defendants Lucy and Charles Grange, Ethiopia Habtemariam, Motown Records, Love Records, and Universal Music Group willfully failed to timely file required tax disclosures surrounding the funding of these sex trafficking parties with the federal government, because doing so would imperil its ability to profit from the sex trafficking venture. Defendants Lucy and Charles Grange, Ethiopia Habtemariam, Motown Records, Love Records, and Universal Music Group concealment of the cash transaction caused it to receive financial benefits through the continuation of the Combs sex trafficking venture. C. Among the concrete steps that defendants Lucy and Charles Grange, Ethiopia Habtemariam, Motown Records, Love Records, and Universal Music Group took to aid the Combs sex trafficking venture were its failure to follow AML requirements. This failure was not just passive facilitation, but a deliberate omission by defendants Lucy and Charles Grange, Ethiopia Habtemariam, Motown Records, Love Records, and Universal Music Group. This omission was a specific act of concealment which allowed Combs to continue funding his sex trafficking venture through suspicious transactions that would have otherwise been prevented. D. By taking the concrete steps outlined above, along with the others alleged in this complaint, defendants Lucy and Charles Grange, Ethiopia Habtemariam, Motown Records, Love Records, and Universal Music Group knowingly participated in sex trafficking and furthered the Combs sex trafficking venture. The concrete steps above constituted taking part in the sex trafficking venture and were necessary for its success. The concrete steps above constituted active engagement by defendants Lucy and Charles Grange, Ethiopia Habtemariam, Motown Records, Love Records, and Universal Music Groups in Combs' sex trafficking venture. E. Defendants Lucy and Charles Grange, Ethiopia Habtemariam, Motown Records, Love Records, and Universal Music Group knowingly and intentionally benefited financially from and received value for its participation in the sex trafficking venture in which Mr. Combs, with defendants Lucy and Charles Grange, Ethiopia Habtemariam, Motown Records, Love Records, and Universal Music Group's knowledge or their reckless disregard of the fact that Combs would use means of force, threats of force, fraud, coercion, and a combination of such means to cause Plaintiff Jones, as well as others, some of who were under the age of 17, to engage in commercial sex acts. F. Defendants Lucy and Charles Grange, Ethiopia Habtemariam, Motown Records, Love Records, and Universal Music Group knew, through years of lawsuits, hush money settlements, and notice that was provided by Miss Cassie Ventura at the beginning of 2023, that Mr. Combs was engaging in sex trafficking, and that defendants Lucy and Charles Grange, Ethiopia Habtemariam, Motown Records, Love Records, and Universal Music Group was participating in a particular sex trafficking venture, i.e., the coercive Combs sex trafficking venture outlined above. Defendants Lucy and Charles Grange, Ethiopia Habtemariam, Motown Records, Love Records, and Universal Music Group's knowledge went far beyond having an abstract awareness of sex trafficking in general. Indeed, defendants Lucy and Charles Grange, Ethiopia Habtemariam, were present at Chalice Recording Studios and in Mr. Combs' Miami, LA, and New York City homes while he was actively engaging in freak-off parties and sex trafficking, and the large amounts of cash that defendants Lucy and Charles Grange, Ethiopia Habtemariam, Motown Records, Love Records, and Universal Music Group were giving him. Thus, defendants Lucy and Charles Grange, Ethiopia Habtemariam, Motown Records, Love Records, and Universal Music Group did not simply fail to adequately detect signs of Combs sex trafficking. It did detect multiple signs of Combs' coercive sex trafficking venture and continued to participate in the venture. Defendants Lucy and Charles Grange, Ethiopia Habtemariam, Motown Records, Love Records, and Universal Music Group knew that the venture was ongoing, which is why Combs required vast sums of cash. G. Defendants Lucy and Charles Grange, Ethiopia Habtemariam, Motown Records, Love Records, and Universal Music Group's actions extend well beyond a situation of failing to train themselves and their staff about recognizing the warning signs of sex trafficking. Defendants Lucy and Charles Grange, Ethiopia Habtemariam, Motown Records, Love Records, and Universal Music Group's employees did recognize the signs of Combs' sex trafficking. Indeed, defendants Lucy and Charles Grange, Ethiopia Habtemariam, Motown Records, Love Records, and Universal Music Group's employees knew about Combs' sex trafficking venture, but defendants Lucy and Charles Grange, Ethiopia Habtemariam, Motown Records, Love Records, and Universal Music Group decided to continue facilitating the Combs' sex trafficking venture rather than ending its participation in the venture. B. Among the signs that defendants Lucy and Charles Grange, Ethiopia Habtemariam, Motown Records, Love Records, and Universal Music Group was facilitating Combs' sex trafficking venture were those facts that came to the attention of defendants Lucy and Charles Grange, Ethiopia Habtemariam, Motown Records, Love Records, and Universal Music Group from the reporting of Mr. Cassie Ventura mentioned above. Among the signs that defendants Lucy and Charles Grange, Ethiopia Habtemariam, Motown Records, Love Records, and Universal Music Group was facilitating Combs' sex trafficking venture were those facts that came to the attention of defendants Lucy and Charles Grange, Ethiopia Habtemariam, Motown Records, Love Records, and Universal Music Group were those facts that came to its attention through complaints filed by Casey Ventura of Combs' sex trafficking. Because of those complaints, defendants Lucy and Charles Grange, Ethiopia Habtemariam, Motown Records, Love Records, and Universal Music Group knew to a certainty that Combs was engaged in sex trafficking. J. Defendants Lucy and Charles Grange, Ethiopia's Habtemariam, are officers of defendants Motown Records, Love Records, and Universal Music Group, and knew the names of many of the Combs' sex trafficking freak-off participants: Young Miami, Daphne Joy, Stevie J, and Jade. K. Defendants Lucy and Charles Grange, Ethiopia Habtemariam, Motown Records, Love Records, and Universal Music Group helped to conceal the names of Combs' victims from the public and from law enforcement and prosecuting agencies by helping to conceal the existence of the sex trafficking venture. Among the ways in which defendants Lucy and Charles Grange, Ethiopia Habtemariam, Motown Records, Love Records, and Universal Music Group helped to conceal the venture's existence was by providing the cash necessary for the venture to avoid leaving a visible paper trail. Additionally, they employed and empowered Fahim Muhammad and defendant Quorum to pay off law enforcement and to compensate the sex workers with cash. L. Defendants Lucian and Charles Grange, Ethiopia Habtemariam, Motown Records, Love Records, and Universal Music Group's concealment included failing to provide enhanced monitoring that was required for someone like Combs. Defendants Lucian, Charles Grange, Ethiopia Habtemariam, Motown Records, Love Records, and Universal Music Group failed to implement an enhanced monitoring of Mr. Combs' sexual parties to ensure that underage girls and sex workers were not present. They failed to do this specifically to help conceal Combs' ongoing sex trafficking. Defendants Lucy and Charles Grange, Ethiopia Habtemariam, Motown Records, Love Records, and Universal Music Group knew that if it implemented that enhanced monitoring, it would have to stop providing Combs with the cash needed to run his sex trafficking venture. M. Defendants Lucy and Charles Grange, Ethiopia Habtemariam, Motown Records, Love Records, and Universal Music Group's concealment, including failing to report Mr. Combs' suspicious sex trafficking activities to law enforcement, and for failing to report their financial support and sponsorship of Mr. Combs' sex trafficking parties to the federal government for tax purposes. N. In addition to having actual knowledge that it was participating in Combs' sex trafficking venture, defendants Lucy and Charles Grange, Ethiopia Habtemariam, Motown Records, Love Records, and Universal Music Group had constructive knowledge that it was participating in Combs' sex trafficking venture. Defendants Lucy and Charles Grange, Ethiopia Habtemariam, Motown Records, Love Records, and Universal Music Group also had constructive knowledge that plaintiff James and other underage minors were being coercively sex trafficked by Combs. Its constructive knowledge extended to the names of Combs' victims because Combs and his associates knew the names of the victims. Mr. Combs had hundreds of cameras in his homes in L.A., New York City, and Miami. Mr. Combs required the sex workers and underage girls to sign NDAs prior to entering his parties and prior to being drugged and sex trafficked at these parties. O. Defendants Lucy and Charles Grange, Ethiopia Habtemariam, Motown Records, Love Records, and Universal Music Group had constructive knowledge of Combs' sex trafficking venture because of specific acts by Mr. Combs that put it on notice of a particular and ongoing sex trafficking venture. Among the specific acts were Combs' use of vast sums of cash, drugs, fake promises of career opportunities, and access to music industry executives in circumstances that should have prompted defendants Lucy and Charles Grange, Ethiopia Habtemariam, Motown Records, Love Records, and Universal Music Group employees to specifically raise questions about Combs' sex trafficking. P. Also among the specific acts giving rise to constructive knowledge were the facts that associates of Mr. Combs made numerous cash withdrawals from defendants Lucy and Charles Grange, Ethiopia Habtemariam, Motown Records, Love Records, and Universal Music Group accounts through Mr. Combs' accountant Robin Greenhill. The circumstances of these withdrawals gave defendants notice that Mr. Combs' sex trafficking enterprise was being funded. Q. Among the financial benefits that the defendants Lucy and Charles Grange, Ethiopia Habtemariam, Motown Records, Love Records, and Universal Music Group received for participating and facilitating Combs' sex trafficking venture were the affiliation and access to Mr. Combs' popularity. Mr. Combs was known for throwing the best parties. Affiliation with and or sponsorship of Mr. Combs' sex trafficking parties garnered legitimacy and access to celebrities such as famous athletes, political figures, artists, musicians, and international dignitaries like British Royal Prince Harry. Mr. Combs and Combs-controlled entities made to defendants Lucy and Charles Grange, Ethiopia Habtemariam, Motown Records, Love Records, and Universal Music Group Defendants Lucy and Charles Grange, Ethiopia Habtemariam, Motown Records, Love Records, and Universal Music Group profited from their affiliation with Mr. Combs and their sponsorship of his sex trafficking parties. Mr. Combs and Combs-controlled entities used the sponsorship funds in exchange for defendants Lucy and Charles Grange, Ethiopia Habtemariam, Motown Records, Love Records, and Universal Music Group's facilitation and participation in the sex trafficking venture, including its willingness to provide large amounts of cash in suspicious circumstances and to allow their failure to report these sponsorships on their taxes to the U.S. federal government to avoid triggering suspicions of the federal government. R. Among the financial benefits that defendants Lucy and Charles Grange, Ethiopia Habtemariam, Motown Records, Love Records, and Universal Music Group received for participating in Combs' sex trafficking venture was referral of business opportunities from Mr. Combs and his co-conspirators, access to up-and-coming artists, producers, and songwriters, and creatives. Defendants Lucy and Charles Grange, Ethiopia Habtemariam, Motown Records, Love Records, and the Universal Music Group profited from these referred business opportunities. Mr. Combs referred business entities and business opportunities to defendants Lucy and Charles Grange, Ethiopia Habtemariam, Motown Records, Love Records, and Universal Music Group in exchange for its facilitation and participation in the sex trafficking venture. These referrals were a quid pro quo for defendants Lucy and Charles Grange, Ethiopia Habtemariam, Motown Records, Love Records, and Universal Music Group's participation in the sex trafficking venture. S. Defendants Lucy and Charles Grange, Ethiopia Habtemariam, Motown Records, Love Records, and Universal Music Group financially profited from the deposits made by Combs and Combs-controlled entities and from the business opportunities referred to defendants Lucy and Charles Grange, Ethiopia Habtemariam, Motown Records, Love Records, and Universal Music Group by Combs in exchange for its facilitation and participation in Combs' sex trafficking venture. Defendants Lucy and Charles Grange, Ethiopia Habtemariam, Motown Records, Love Records, and Universal Music Group knowingly received financial benefits in return for its assistance, support, and facilitation of Combs' sex trafficking venture. Defendants Lucy and Charles Grange, Ethiopia Habtemariam, Motown Records, Love Records, and Universal Music Group knew that if it stopped assisting, supporting, and facilitating of Combs' sex trafficking ventures, it would no longer receive those benefits. U. Defendants Lucy and Charles Grange, Ethiopia Habtemariam, Motown Records, Love Records, and Universal Music Group knew and was in reckless disregard of the fact that it was Combs' pattern and practice to use the channels and instrumentalities of interstate and foreign commerce, private jets, yachts, and commercial airplanes to entice, recruit, solicit, harbor, provide, obtain, and transport young women, young men, and underage girls for purposes of causing commercial sex acts in violation of 18 U.S.C. 1591 A1. V. Defendants Lucy and Charles Grange, Ethiopia Habtemariam, Motown Records, Love Records, and Universal Music Group and its employees had actual knowledge that they were facilitating Combs' sexual abuse and sex trafficking conspiracy to recruit, solicit, entice, coerce, harbor, transport, obtain, and provide Mr. Jones into commercial sex acts through the means of force, threats of force, fraud, abuse of process, and coercion, and the combination of all these means. W. Despite such knowledge, defendants Lucy and Charles Grange, Ethiopia Habtemariam, Motown Records, Love Records, and Universal Music Group intentionally paid for, facilitated, and participated in Combs' violation of 18 U.S.C. 1591 A1, which defendants Lucy and Charles Grange, Ethiopia Habtemariam, Motown Records, Love Records, and Universal Music Group knew and were in reckless disregard of the fact that Combs would coerce, defraud, and force Mr. Jones to engage in commercial sex acts. X. Defendants Lucy and Charles Grange, Ethiopia Habtemariam, Motown Records, Love Records, and Universal Music Group, through its employees and agents, actively participated in the sex trafficking conspiracy and led Mr. Jones' sex workers, and underage girls to believe that they would be rewarded if they cooperated and acquiesced to Mr. Combs' coercive demands. Y. Defendants Lucy and Charles Grange, Ethiopia Haptimerium, Motown Records, Love Records, and Universal Music Group's affirmative conduct was committed knowingly and in reckless disregard of the facts that Mr. Combs would use cash and financial support provided by defendants Lucy and Charles Grange, Ethiopia Haptimerium, Motown Records, Love Records, and Universal Music Group as a mean of defrauding, forcing, and coercing sex acts from Mr. Jones. Defendants Lucy and Charles Grange, Ethiopia Haptimerium, Motown Records, Love Records, and Universal Music Group's conduct was outrageous and intentional. Z. In addition to actual knowledge that it was outrageous, that it was participating in and facilitating the Combs' sex trafficking venture, defendants Lucy and Charles Grange, Ethiopia Haptimerium, Motown Records, Love Records, and Universal Music Group also should have known that it was participating in and facilitating a venture that had engaged in coercive sex trafficking as covered by 18 UFC 1595A. Double A. In exchange for facilitating and covering up Combs' commercial sex trafficking, the defendants Lucy and Charles Grange, Ethiopia Haptimerium, advancing their careers at defendants Motown Records, Love Records, and Universal Music Group, and received financial benefits therefrom by securing the defendants Motown Records, Love Record, and Universal Music Group Sean Combs' relationship. Double B. Facilitating and covering up sexual trafficking and misconduct was a means of obtaining economic success and promotion within the defendants Lucy and Charles Grange, Ethiopia Haptimerium, Motown Records, Love Records, and the Universal Music Group hierarchy. Double C. Defendants Lucy and Charles Grange, Ethiopia Haptimerium, Motown Records, Love Records, and Universal Music Group's knowing and intentional conduct has caused Mr. Jones serious harm, including without limitation, physical, psychological, emotional, financial, and reputational harm. Double D. Defendants Lucy and Charles Grange, Ethiopia Haptimerium, Motown Records, Love Records, and Universal Music Group's knowing and intentional conduct has caused Mr. Jones harm that is sufficiently serious under all the surrounding circumstances to compel a reasonable person of the same background and in the same circumstances to perform or to continue performing commercial sexual activity to avoid incurring harm. Double E. This case does not involve mere fraud. Instead, defendants Lucy and Charles Grange, Ethiopia Haptimerium, Motown Records, Love Records, and Universal Music Group's criminal conduct in violating the TVPA was outrageous and intentional because it was in deliberate furtherance of a widespread and dangerous criminal sex trafficking organization. Defendants Lucy and Charles Grange, Ethiopia Haptimerium, Motown Records, Love Records, and Universal Music Group's criminal conduct also evinced a high degree of moral turpitude and demonstrated such wanton dishonesty as to imply a criminal indifference for civil obligations. Defendants Lucy and Charles Grange, Ethiopia Haptimerium, Motown Records, Love Records, and Universal Music Group's criminal conduct was directed specifically at Mr. Jones, who was the victim of Combs' sexual abuse and sex trafficking organization. Double F. Defendants Lucy and Charles Grange, Ethiopia Haptimerium, Motown Records, Love Records, and Universal Music Group's outrageous and intentional conduct in this case is part of a pattern and practice of defendants Lucy and Charles Grange, Ethiopia Haptimerium, Motown Records, Love Records, and Universal Music Group profiting by undertaking illegal high-risk, high-reward partnerships and sponsorships. 318. By virtue of these knowing and intentional violations of 18 U.S.C. 1591 A2 1595, defendants Lucy and Charles Grange, Ethiopia Haptimerium, Motown Records, Love Records, and Universal Music Group is liable to Mr. Jones for the damages he sustained and reasonable attorney's fees. 15th cause of action. Obstruction of the enforcement of the Trafficking Victim Protection Act, 18 U.S.C. 1591D, against defendants Lucy and Charles Grange, Ethiopia Haptimerium, Motown Records, Love Records, and Universal Music Group. 319. Mr. Jones incorporates by reference all preceding paragraphs and realleges them as if set forth fully herein. 320. Defendants Lucy and Charles Grange, Ethiopia Haptimerium, Motown Records, Love Records, and Universal Music Group and its officers and employees knowingly and intentionally obstructed, attempted to obstruct, and interfered with and prevented the enforcement of 18 U.S.C. 1591 A1 and A2, all in violation of 18 U.S.C. 1591D. This activity is hereinafter referred to collectively simply as obstruction. 321. Defendants Lucy and Charles Grange, Ethiopia Habtemariam, Motown Records, Love Records, and Universal Music Group's obstruction of the enforcement of 18 U.S.C. 1591 A1 and A2 was forbidden by 18 U.S.C. 1591 D. And defendants Lucy and Charles Grange, Ethiopia Habtemariam, Motown Records, Love Records, and Universal Music Group thereby violated Chapter 77, Title 18. Defendants Lucy and Charles Grange, Ethiopia Habtemariam, Motown Records, Love Records, and Universal Music Group's obstruction described here and in the preceding paragraph directly, proximately, and foreseeably harmed Mr. Jones by directly resulting in him coercively being caused to engage in commercial sex acts and in other ways. 322. Defendant Sean Combs has a well-documented history of criminal investigations. Defendants Lucy and Charles Grange, Ethiopia Habtemariam, Motown Records, Love Records, and Universal Music Groups were on notice of Mr. Combs' proclivity to criminal activity. They knew or should have known that Mr. Combs' sex trafficking operation would or could result in a criminal investigation by state and federal prosecutors for violating, among other laws, the TVPA. Defendants Lucy and Charles Grange, Ethiopia Habtemariam, Motown Records, Love Records, and Universal Music Group should have taken a cue from the federal prosecutor's arrest and prosecution of Jeffrey Epstein on or about July 8, 2019. On or about that date, the U.S. Attorney's Office for the Southern District of New York indicted Epstein and unnamed associates for violating the TVPA. Later, on about June 29, 2020, the same office indicted Epstein's co-conspirator, Ghislaine Maxwell, for conspiracy to entice minor victims to travel to be abused by Epstein. Mr. Combs, defendant J. Combs, Coram, and her direct reports, Brendan Paul, Frankie Santella, and Moy Bond, all engaged in the same activities as Mr. Epstein and Miss Maxwell. In fact, Mr. Combs, defendants J. Combs, Coram, and her direct reports, Brendan Paul, Frankie Santella, and Moy Bond, may have done worse. 323. By providing financing for Mr. Combs' sex trafficking organization and concealing in actions thereafter, defendants Lucy and Charles Grange, Ethiopia Habtemariam, Motown Records, Love Records, and Universal Music Group obstructed, interfered with, and prevented the state and federal government enforcement of the TVPA against Mr. Combs. Defendants J. Combs, Coram, and her direct reports, Brendan Paul, Frankie Santella, and Moy Bond. To the extent that the federal government was able to ultimately charge Mr. Combs, defendants J. Combs, Coram, and her direct reports, Brendan Paul, Frankie Santella, and Moy Bond, with TVPA violations. The filing of those charges was delayed by the defendants Lucy and Charles Grange, Ethiopia Habtemariam, Motown Record, Love Record, and Universal Music Group's actions. Because of that delay, Mr. Jones was coercively caused to engage in commercial sex acts. 324. As one example of how defendants Lucy and Charles Grange, Ethiopia Habtemariam, Motown Records, Love Records, and Universal Music Group attempted to obstruct, interfered with, and prevented state and federal government's enforcement of the TVPA, defendants Lucy and Charles Grange, Ethiopia Habtemariam, Motown Records, Love Records, and Universal Music Group provided large amounts of cash to Mr. Combs and his associates so that the coercive commercial sex acts would escape the detection of state and federal law enforcement and prosecuting agencies. Defendants Lucy and Charles Grange, Ethiopia Habtemariam, Motown Records, Love Records, and Universal Music Group provided large amounts of cash to further the Mr. Combs, defendant J. Combs, Coram, and her direct reports, Brendan Paul, Frankie Santella, and Moy Bond's sex trafficking venture, and with the purpose of helping Mr. Combs' defendants J. Combs, Coram, and her direct reports, Brendan Paul, Frankie Santella, and Moy Bond evade criminal liability for violating the TVPA. 325. As an example of how defendants Lucy and Charles Grange, Ethiopia Habtemariam, Motown Records, Love Records, and Universal Music Group obstructed, attempted to obstruct, interfered with, and prevented state and federal government's enforcement of the TVPA, defendants Lucy and Charles Grange, Ethiopia Habtemariam, Motown Records, Love Records, and Universal Music Group failed to timely file with the state and federal government that required tax forms that detailed the sponsorship and partnership payments provided by defendants to Mr. Combs. Timely filing of these reports is required by the United States Tax Code and related laws and regulations. These reports are tools that the state and federal government use to detect and prosecute, among other illegal activities, sex trafficking in violation of the TVPA by failing to timely file the required tax reporting documents regarding Mr. Combs' sponsorship cash transactions. Defendants Lucy and Charles Grange, Ethiopia Habtemariam, Motown Records, Love Records, and Universal Music Group attempted to obstruct, interfered with, and prevented the government's enforcement of the TVPA by concealing from the government intention Mr. Combs' cash transaction in aid of sex trafficking. 327. By providing large amounts of cash to Mr. Combs and his associates, defendants Lucy and Charles Grange, Ethiopia Habtemariam, Motown Records, Love Records, and Universal Music Group intended and knew that Mr. Combs' coercive commercial sex acts would escape the detection of law enforcement and prosecuting agencies for some period of time. Defendants Lucy and Charles Grange, Ethiopia Habtemariam, Motown Records, Love Records, and Universal Music Group provided large amounts of cash to further the Combs sex trafficking venture and with the purpose of helping Mr. Combs evade criminal liability for violating the TVPA. 327. Defendants Lucy and Charles Grange, Ethiopia Habtemariam, Motown Records, Love Records, and Universal Music Group's obstruction, attempted obstruction, interference with, and prevention of the enforcement of the TVPA were all done intentionally and knowingly. For example, defendants Lucy and Charles Grange, Ethiopia Habtemariam, Motown Records, Love Records, and Universal Music Group knew that Mr. Combs was high risk, specifically high risk to violate the TVPA through continuing criminal sex trafficking activities, as evidenced by Casey Ventura's civil complaint. She informed members of Mr. Combs' parent label about the abuse he was visiting upon her. And instead of coming to her rescue, they forced her to return his calls and to return to his sex trafficking enterprise. 328. Defendants Lucy and Charles Grange, Ethiopia Habtemariam, Motown Records, Love Records, and Universal Music Group was unaware that Mr. Combs had a laundry list of criminal charges and barely escaped serving prison time. Upon information and belief, Mr. Combs engaged in witness intimidation and bribery to escape criminal liability for shooting Natanya Rubin in the face. Defendants Lucy and Charles Grange, Ethiopia Habtemariam, Motown Records, Love Records, and Universal Music Group was aware that there were public allegations that Mr. Combs' illegal conduct was facilitated by several named co-conspirators. They were made aware of this through complaints made by Cassie Ventura and the lawsuit by former Diddy sex worker Jonathan Oddie. Defendants Lucy and Charles Grange, Ethiopia Habtemariam, Motown Records, Love Records, and the Universal Music Group concealed from state and federal government its numerous cash payments to those co-conspirators. Defendants Lucy and Charles Grange, Ethiopia Habtemariam, Motown Records, Love Records, and Universal Music Group continued its affirmative conduct of providing cash to Mr. Combs and his associates so that he could make those cash payments to his co-conspirators with knowledge that such cash transaction did not produce a clear paper trail. Defendants Lucy and Charles Grange, Ethiopia Habtemariam, Motown Records, Love Records, and Universal Music Group's intentional conduct attempted to obstruct, in many ways interfered with, and prevented the enforcement of the TVPA by investigators and prosecuting agencies. 329. Defendants Lucy and Charles Grange, Ethiopia Habtemariam, Motown Records, Love Records, and Universal Music Group's relationship with Mr. Combs and providing to his sex trafficking venture with vast sums of cash each year went far beyond a normal and lawful sponsorship, partnership, and employer-employee relationship. Defendants Lucy and Charles Grange, Ethiopia Habtemariam, Motown Records, Love Records, and Universal Music Group knew and intended that its relationship with Mr. Combs go far beyond a normal music industry relationship. Defendants Lucy and Charles Grange, Ethiopia Habtemariam, Motown Records, Love Records, and Universal Music Group knew that its decision to go beyond a normal music relationship with Mr. Combs obstructed the ability of law enforcement and prosecuting agencies to enforce the TVPA. 330. Defendants Lucy and Charles Grange, Ethiopia Habtemariam, Motown Records, Love Records, and Universal Music Group's destruction of the government's TVPA and other law enforcement efforts was intentional and willful, and therefore defendants Lucy and Charles Grange, Ethiopia Habtemariam, Motown Records, Love Records, and Universal Music Group intentionally and willfully caused Mr. Combs' commission of the forcible commercial sex acts with Mr. Jones through its obstruction supporting the concealment of Mr. Combs' sex trafficking venture. Defendants Lucy and Charles Grange, Ethiopia Have to Marry Him, Motown Records, Love Records, and Universal Music Group knew that Mr. Combs and his other co-conspirators would use means of force, threats of force, fraud, coercion, and a combination of such means to cause Mr. Jones to engage in commercial sex acts. 331. Defendants Lucy and Charles Grange, Ethiopia Have to Marry Him, Motown Records, Love Records, and Universal Music Group knew, acted in reckless disregard of the fact and should have known that its obstruction in violation of 18 U.S.C. 1591 would directly and proximately lead to unlawful coercive commercial sexual acts by Mr. Combs with men like Plaintiff Jones, young men, women, and young girls. 332. Defendants Lucy and Charles Grange, Ethiopia Have to Marry Him, Motown Records, Love Records, and Universal Music Group's obstruction has caused Mr. Jones harm that is sufficiently serious under all the surrounding circumstances to compel a reasonable person of the same background and in the same circumstance to perform or to continue performing commercial sexual activity to avoid incurring that harm. 334. This case does not involve mere fraud. Instead, defendants Lucy and Charles Grange, Ethiopia Have to Marry Him, Motown Records, Love Records, and Universal Music Group's criminal conduct in obstructing enforcement of the TVPA was outrageous and intentional because it was in deliberate furtherance of a widespread and dangerous criminal sex trafficking organization. Defendants Lucy and Charles Grange, Ethiopia Have to Marry Him, Motown Records, Love Records, and Universal Music Group's obstruction also evinced a high degree of moral turpitude and demonstrated such wanton dishonesty as to imply a criminal indifference to civil obligations. Defendants Lucy and Charles Grange, Ethiopia Have to Marry Him, Motown Records, Love Records, and Universal Music Group's obstruction was directed specifically at Mr. Jones, who was the victim of Mr. Combs' sex trafficking organizations. 335. By virtue of these violations of 18 U.S.C. 1591d, defendants Lucy and Charles Grange, Ethiopia Have to Marry Him, Motown Records, Love Records, and Universal Music Group is liable to Mr. Jones for the damages he sustained and reasonable attorney's fees by operation of 18 U.S.C. 1595. Defendants Lucy and Charles Grange, Ethiopia Have to Marry Him, Motown Records, Love Records, and Universal Music Group perpetrated an obstruction of the TVPA and therefore perpetrated a violation of Chapter 77, Title 18. Prayer for relief. Wherefore, plaintiff prays that the court enter judgment in her favor and against defendants containing the following relief. A declaratory judgment that the actions, conduct, and practices of defendants complained of herein violate the laws of the state of New York. B, an award of damages against defendant in an amount to be determined at trial, plus prejudgment interest to compensate plaintiff for all monetary and or economic damages, including but not limited